Montana Territory, winter of 1878. The first night, the mountains stopped forgiving. The man raised his rifle to a sky the color of old iron. Pulled the trigger. Crack. The shot split the frozen air, then vanished, like it never happened. Inside the cabin, his youngest brother looked up, jaw tight. "There's nothing left to cut, Cassian. The numbers don't lie." Cassian set the rifle down, said nothing. The burn scar along his left jaw caught the firelight, pale, silent, same as him. That's when they heard it. A wheel shattering, horses screaming. Then the heavy, final crash of something going down hard in the snow. All three brothers hit the door at once, and in the overturned wagon, half frozen, barely breathing, a woman. "Stay with me." The sky over Storm Ridge had turned the color of old iron, flat, and pressing down on the mountains like a lid. Cassian Delaney stood on the porch of the cabin with his lever-action Colt raised to the clouds. He pulled the trigger. The shot cracked through the frozen air, loud and sharp and gone just as fast. A few crows scattered from the pine line. The gray sky didn't flinch. He lowered the rifle. It wasn't a prayer. He was done with prayers. It was something else, the only language a man had left when words ran out, and the walls felt like they were closing in from all four sides. He pressed the barrel cool against his palm, turned, and walked back inside. The cabin was warm from the fire, but the warmth didn't reach everything. Rowan stood at the supply shelf with a piece of paper in his hand, reading the numbers on it like they might change if he stared hard enough. He was the quieter of the two younger brothers, lean and sharp-eyed, the kind of man who noticed things other people missed: footprints, shadows, the way the wind shifted before a storm. He noticed everything except how to make a problem disappear when the problem was money. "We're short," Rowan said without turning around. "Feed for the horses will last maybe 6 weeks. Flour, salt, dried meat, maybe 8. After that, we're cutting into nothing." Callan was sitting on the edge of the table, with his boots on the bench, which he knew Cassian hated. He was the youngest by a few years, built wide and restless, hair always just a little too long, always looking like he'd either just gotten out of trouble or was about to walk straight into it. He had that particular kind of energy in him that couldn't sit still, the kind that made him exceptional with wild horses and absolutely terrible at long winters. "So we cut back," Callan said. "We've already cut back." "Then we cut back more." "Callan." Rowan's voice was flat. "There isn't more to cut." Cassian set the rifle on its rack by the door. He said nothing for a moment. He'd learned a long time ago, during the war, that silence was sometimes the only useful thing he could offer. Let the fire burn itself down. Let men say their piece. Callan pushed off the table and stood up, spreading his arms wide. "Then what's your genius plan, Rowan?" "Wait for spring and hope something falls out of the sky. My plan is to not panic and do something stupid." "Who said anything about panicking?" "I'm just saying we can't eat your math, brother. And I'm saying your optimism won't feed the horses." Cassian turned around. "Enough." Both brothers stopped. That was the thing about Cassian. He didn't raise his voice often, and because of that, when he did, it meant something. He was 6'3", and built like the work had put him together, slowly, over 31 years, hammering him into shape one season at a time. There was a burn scar that ran from his jaw down the left side of his neck, onto his shoulder, wide and pale, and something he'd stopped trying to hide a long time ago. It had happened at the forge, years back. It had taken his looks on that side, or so he believed. He didn't talk about it. "We'll figure it out," Cassian said. "We've been through worse." Neither of his brothers argued with that. They all knew what worse looked like. Their parents were gone. The war was behind them. The ranch was theirs, because they'd held onto it with their hands when everything else fell away. They knew how to survive. What they were less sure about was how to do anything beyond surviving. Outside, the first real wind of the blizzard hit the cabin wall. The logs groaned, the fire in the stove shuddered, and then steadied. Cassian moved to the window and looked out. The sky had dropped. What had been gray iron an hour ago was now a moving white wall coming down off the ridge. He could see maybe 30 yards past the fence line. In another few minutes, he wouldn't be able to see that much. "Storm's here," he said. Rowan folded the supply list and tucked it into his jacket. We should bring the horses into the shelter. I'll do it. Kalen moved to grab his coat. That was when they heard it, not thunder. Thunder had a slow roll to it, a build. This was sharp and sudden, two distinct sounds, the crack of a wheel axle breaking, and immediately after it, the crash of something large and heavy. Then, the horses screaming. All three brothers moved at once. Cassian had his coat on before Kalen got the door open. Rowan grabbed a lantern, even though the last of the gray light was still holding on. Good thinking. In 20 minutes, they'd need it. They ran toward the sound. It had happened just north of their fence line, where the old trail bent sharply around a cluster of boulders. A freight wagon had come off the path. One of the wheels had shattered against a rock hidden under fresh snow, and the whole rig had gone sideways, taking the horses down with it. Both animals were struggling but alive, tangled in harness, thrashing in the snow. The driver was not alive. He was slumped half over the bench seat, thrown forward by the crash, and he hadn't moved. Cassian could see it immediately, the entry wound at the man's back, already frozen dark against his coat. He'd been shot before the wagon ever reached the bend. Whoever had fired had done it from the tree line, somewhere up the ridge. Ambush, Rowan said quietly. Recent, Cassian said. We would have heard the shot. Might have been the one I heard before the storm hit. I thought it was farther off. They looked at each other. There was a whole conversation in that look. One they'd been having since they were boys, the kind that moved too fast for words and didn't need them. Kalen had already moved to the animals. He was talking to them in a low, steady voice, hands out, slow. Whatever his faults, Kalen had a gift with frightened things. He could talk a wild horse down from blind panic just by the sound of him, patient and calm and sure. He didn't panic around fear. He understood it. Cassian moved to the wagon. He wasn't sure exactly what he expected to find, supplies maybe or cargo of some kind. What he found was the canvas covering over the wagon bed had come loose at one corner, and underneath it, pressed against the far side wall, was a woman. She was unconscious. Young, he could see that much. She was wearing a dark wool dress and a heavy traveling coat, both of which were soaked through, the lower portions frozen stiff where they'd been exposed to the elements. Her face was pale in a way that wasn't natural, and when he pressed his fingers to her throat, her pulse was there but thin, and her skin was cold enough to alarm him. There's a passenger, Cassian said. Rowan came to look. He bent down, studied her, and his jaw tightened. Hypothermia. Yeah. How long has she been in this cold? No way to know. We need to move her. Cassian climbed into the wagon bed carefully, moving slowly so he wouldn't jostle her more than necessary. He pulled back the canvas to get a better look. She was shivering, which was something shivering meant. Her body was still fighting. Stopped shivering was when you started to really worry. He saw it. Then, tucked inside the fold of her coat where her arm was pressed against her body. A document case, oilskin wrapped, the kind that kept papers dry. It had come partially open. He could see the edge of a contract inside, stamped with formal seals, and at the top, in clear printed letters, mail order bride contract. He looked at her for a moment. He didn't know what life had brought her to this mountain, in the middle of a blizzard, alone in a wagon with a dead driver, and hired guns somewhere up in the trees. He didn't need to know. Not yet. He put the document back. Kalen, he called out, leave the horses for now. They're not going anywhere. I need you here. Together, Cassian and Kalen lifted her out of the wagon bed carefully, one taking her shoulders, one her legs, keeping her body as level as they could manage. She didn't wake up. She made a small sound, once not pain exactly, more like something exhausted and far away, and then went still again. Rowan took point with the lantern, leading them back through the snow. The wind had found its full strength by the time they reached the cabin door. It hit them sideways, hard enough that Kalen had to turn his shoulder into it to keep his footing. They got her inside. The warmth of the cabin was immediate, and for a moment all three of them just stood there in the middle of the room, holding a woman none of them had ever seen before, with the blizzard pressing against the walls outside and the fire crackling steady in the stove. Set her by the fire, Cassian said. Gently. They laid her. On the bedroll Rowan had quickly spread out on the floor, close enough to the stove to catch the heat, but not so close it would be a shock to her system. She was still shivering. Her lips had a slight bluish tinge that made Cassian's chest tighten. He assessed her the way a practical man did, not clinical, not cold, but focused. What does she need, and in what order? Her feet were the immediate problem. The lower hem of her dress was stiff with ice, and he could see through the fabric that her feet and lower legs had been exposed long enough that frostbite was a real possibility. If the tissue had frozen and he let it stay frozen, she could lose feeling. She could lose worse. Get the warm compresses ready, he told Rowan. Not hot, warm. You know the difference. I know. Cassian took his hunting knife from his belt. He held it for a moment, looking at her, aware of what he was about to do and wanting to be deliberate about it. She was unconscious. She couldn't consent to what came next, and that mattered to him. It mattered even if she never knew it happened. He positioned the blade at the hem of her dress, right at the ankle, and cut upward carefully, only as far as he needed to go to her knee, no further. He folded the fabric back, exposing her feet and lower legs, which were an alarming pale gray. He did not look anywhere. He did not need to look. He did not touch anything he did not need to touch. He pressed the first warm compress to the arch of her right foot, held it steady, and watched for the color to start coming back. Kaelin was crouched a few feet away. Watching all of this with an expression Cassian couldn't fully read, somewhere between uncomfortable and something more serious. She's going to be okay? Kaelin asked. She has a real chance, Cassian said. She's still fighting. That's on her. Rowan brought water to a low heat on the stove. He moved quietly, efficiently. He wasn't good at many domestic things, but in a crisis, Rowan was exactly who you wanted in the room. He didn't flutter. He just worked. They stayed like that for a while, the three of them, as the blizzard outside built itself into a full wall of white noise against the logs, and the woman's color slowly started to return to something closer to living. At one point, Cassian replaced the compress on her left foot and noticed the faint warmth starting to come back into the skin. Progress. Real progress. He sat back on his heels and looked at her face. She was younger than he'd thought at first, no more than early 20s, with dark circles under her eyes that had nothing to do with the cold. The kind of tired that lived in a person before any of this had happened to her today. She'd been running from something or toward something, and either way, she'd landed here. He didn't know what was in that contract. He didn't know her name. He knew she'd been shot at, left for dead in a frozen wagon in the middle of a Montana blizzard, and that her body was still deciding whether to hold on. He knew that under his roof, whatever happened next, she was going to get the chance to make that decision for herself. The fire popped. Kaelin got up quietly and added another log. Outside, Storm Ridge disappeared into the white. She came back to consciousness the same way a person surfaces from deep water slowly, with effort, aware of pressure before she was aware of anything else. Warmth first. That was the most confusing part. She'd been so cold for so long that the heat around her felt wrong at first, almost suspicious, like something her mind had invented to comfort her while she died. But then she heard the fire, the actual sound of it, wood burning and snapping in a stove, and she knew fire wasn't something you dreamed. You felt it. You smelled it. She smelled it now. Pine resin, gun smoke, leather, and something herbal she couldn't place. She opened her eyes. The ceiling above her was rough-hewn log, dark with age, strung with a few dried bundles of herbs she didn't recognize in the low light. The light itself came from a lantern on a table nearby, and the orange glow of the stove to her left. She was on a bedroll on the floor, covered with a heavy wool blanket, and her feet, she flexed them carefully. Testing her feet felt like they were wrapped in something warm. She turned her head. 3 men stood in the room. They weren't close to her. That registered first, before anything else. They were positioned at a distance, not hovering, not crowding. One sat at the table with his back half turned, watching her over his shoulder. One stood near the window with his arms crossed, still as a post. The third was crouched near the stove, and he was the one looking at her most directly, big, dark-coated, with a burn scar running down the left side of his face and neck that caught the firelight and made it look carved. All three of them were enormous. She'd grown up around soldiers and surgeons and rough men in rough places, but these three had a particular density to them, something built by outdoor labor over many years. They filled the room without trying to. Her hand moved before she decided to move it. It went to her sleeve, to the small leather fold she'd kept there since Boston, and her fingers found the handle of the surgical scalpel by pure muscle memory. She sat up fast, pulled the blanket back, and came to her feet in one motion, despite the wave of dizziness that hit her immediately. She held the scalpel out in front of her, blade forward. Small as it was, she held it like she knew how to use it because she did. None of the three men moved. The one with the scar, the oldest, she thought, or at least the one who carried himself like he'd been the oldest, for a long time raised both his hands slowly, palms out. It was a deliberate gesture, careful, the kind that understood what it meant to have something sharp pointed at you. "Easy," he said. His voice was low and even. "Nobody here is going to touch you." Thalia did not lower the blade. She swept her eyes across all three of them, taking inventory the way she'd been trained, quick, systematic, deciding what was dangerous and what was manageable. The one at the window had a rifle leaning against the wall 6 feet away from him. The one at the table had a pistol holstered at his hip. The scarred one had a knife on his belt, but his hands were still up. "Where am I?" she said. Her voice came out rougher than she expected, scraped raw from the cold. "Montana Territory," the scarred one said. "Storm Ridge. This is our ranch." He kept his hands visible. "My name is Cassian Delaney. Those are my brothers, Rowan." He tilted his head slightly toward the window. Kaylin, toward the table. She looked at each of them when he named them. Rowan was lean and watchful, with dark eyes that moved slowly but missed nothing. Kaylin was younger, broader through the shoulders, and despite the situation, he had something almost open in his face, like he hadn't yet decided to be guarded about everything. "There was a wagon," Thalia said. "You were in it," Cassian said. "The driver was dead when we got there. Ambush. From the tree line. The wheel gave out on the bend just north of our fence. We brought you in." She processed this. The cold came back to her in pieces. The sound of the wheel, the lurch, the impact. She remembered, trying to stay flat and quiet, and then nothing. The cold had taken her under. She looked down at her feet. They were wrapped in warm cloth. She looked at the hem of her dress, cut clean to the knee on both sides. Precise and straight surgical, almost. "You did that," she said to Cassian. "Your feet had started to go gray," he said. "I needed to get to them. I cut the hem because it was frozen solid, and I didn't want to pull at it." She studied him for a moment. The cut was neat, respectful. He'd taken exactly what was necessary and nothing more, and the compresses wrapped around her feet had been applied with some knowledge, not hot enough to shock damaged skin, warm enough to restore circulation. Whoever had done it had known what they were doing, at least well enough. She lowered the scalpel. "Not all the way, but part way, an inch or two. I'm not here to be anybody's property," she said. It came out flat and clear because she needed it to be both those things. Not angry, just absolutely certain. "I'll work for my keep. I know medicine, and I know how to run a household, and I'm not afraid of hard work. But I'm not going to be handled or owned or told what I am. I've had enough of that." The room was quiet for a moment. Kaylin, at the table, leaned back slightly. He wasn't smiling, but there was something in his expression that looked a lot like respect. Rowan at the window hadn't moved, but his eyes had sharpened. Cassian lowered his hand slowly. He looked at her steadily, and she held his gaze, because she'd learned a long time ago that looking away was how you told people they had power over you. "Miss," he said, "the law down in the valley might be rotten, but under the Delaney roof, honor still means something. No one touches you unless you ask for it." She waited. She'd heard promises before. She'd heard them from men who meant them, and from men who were just filling up silence. She was trying to decide which kind this was. What she saw was a man who'd spoken the words without looking away, without adding anything, without softening it into something easier. He just said it, plainly, and let it stand on its own. She put the scalpel back in her sleeve. "Thalia Vance," she said. "I'm a surgical assistant. Trained in Philadelphia, 3 years in field medicine with the Union Army's Civilian Corps." She paused. "I was supposed to arrive at a landholder's property, 2 towns east. I'm guessing the storm ended that plan." "There's no going anywhere for a while," Rowan said from the window. It was the first thing he'd said. His voice was quieter than Cassian's, precise. "Blizzard will run at least 2 more days. Trails buried." Kaelin stood up from the table. He was taller standing than she'd expected, and he moved with the loose, confident energy of someone who spent most of his life outdoors. "You're welcome to stay," he said. "For what it's worth, I think what you just did with that blade was impressive. Most people wake up in a strange place, and they scream. You came up swinging. Screaming doesn't solve anything," she said. He grinned at that, just briefly. "No, it really doesn't." She looked around the cabin more carefully now that her heart had slowed to something closer to normal. It was a working space, not a decorative one. Everything in it had a purpose. The tools hung where they'd be easy to reach. The supply shelves were organized with the precision of people who understood that running out of something in the middle of a Montana winter was not a minor inconvenience. There was a rough bookshelf with maybe a dozen volumes on it, worn to the spine. Almanacs, a medical reference that surprised her, a Bible that looked like it hadn't been opened in a while. She could work with this. She knew how to read a household the way she read a patient, what it told you about how people lived, what they were careful about, what they'd given up on. "I found a contract in your coat," Cassian said. He crossed the room to the table, opened a tin box, and produced the oilskin document case. He set it on the table and left it there, didn't hand it to her, just made it accessible. "It's yours." I didn't read it past the header. She walked to the table and picked it up. She checked the contents, all there, intact, dry inside the oilskin. She'd paid for that case specifically because of the weather. She was glad she had. "Thank you," she said. "The man it was addressed to," Cassian said carefully. "We know him a little. Passed through our county a few times." "I've never met him," Thalia said. "The arrangement was made through a broker in Philadelphia." She paused, then decided they'd earned a little more honesty. "I needed to leave Philadelphia. This was the fastest legal way to put distance between me and the man I was leaving behind." Nobody asked who that man was. She appreciated that. "Well," Kaelin said, "until the storm clears and the trail opens up, you're here." He spread his arms to indicate the cabin. "It's not Philadelphia." "No," she said, and looked around at the rough logs, the practical shelves, the honest firelight. "It's not." She meant it without any sourness in it. Philadelphia had been beautiful and suffocating in equal measure. This was neither beautiful nor suffocating. It was just real. And at the moment, real felt like exactly what she needed. She spent the rest of that first day getting her strength back and making herself useful, which was her instinct in every new environment. Find out how you can contribute and do it, because contributing was the fastest way to make a place feel less foreign. She ate the food they offered her, a dense venison stew that Kaelin had apparently made, which was better than she expected. She drank the hot water with pine needle tea that Rowan prepared without being asked, which she recognized as a reasonable source of vitamin C through the winter months. By afternoon, she was steady on her feet. She asked Cassian if she could look at the supply situation. He looked at her for a beat, and then he said yes, and she spent an hour going through what they had on the shelves and making mental notes. She'd managed supply distribution in Army field hospitals, which was a particular kind of organized chaos, too many needs, never enough resources, make it work anyway. A winter ranch with 3 men was almost restful by comparison. She found their medical supplies in a wooden crate under the work table. There wasn't much: bandages, most of them old, a small bottle of carbolic acid, nearly empty, a tin of salve that smelled like it had seen better days, A few tools she recognized: forceps, a needle and gut thread for suturing, a bone saw she hoped they'd never needed badly. She reorganized the crate, put things in order of what was sterile and what needed to be replaced, moved the carbolic acid to where it would be easy to reach quickly, not buried under other things. Rowan watched her do this from across the room, saying nothing, but she could tell he was paying attention. "You've done this before," he said eventually. "Hundreds of times," she said. "In the field, you keep your medical kit accessible. If you're digging for it in an emergency, someone might die while you're digging." He nodded, slow and considering. He seemed like a man who evaluated information before responding to it, which she found more comfortable than men who responded immediately to everything. "Cassian was in the war," Rowan said. "Scout unit. He saw a lot of field medicine. Is that where the scar is from?" "No, that was here at the forge. 3 years back. He'd been drinking, trying to forget something about the war, and he wasn't paying attention." Rowan paused. "He doesn't talk about it." "People rarely do," she said. "The things that cost them the most." She didn't push further. She just finished organizing the medical crate and moved on. Dinner that night was quieter than she expected. The four of them sat around the rough table, and the meal was simple: more of the venison stew, hardtack, dried apples. The storm was still pushing hard at the cabin walls, but inside the fire held the cold at bay well enough. She could see why they'd built thick. These walls had been meant to outlast Montana winters for a long time. Kalen talked the most, which she was beginning to understand was just his nature. He told her about the ranch in the casual, proprietary way of someone who loved a place and took for granted that she'd understand why. They ran cattle, did some fur trade in winter, took in bronc-busting work when it was available. 3 brothers, 1 ranch, inherited from their parents who'd come out here from Tennessee before the war and built it from nothing. "Do you make enough?" she asked. Kalen stopped, looked at Cassian. Cassian, at the end of the table, turned his mug slowly in his hand. "Not as much as we need to," he said. She didn't ask more than that yet. She could see it in the supply shelves, in the things worn past where they should have been replaced, in the way Rowan had folded that piece of paper earlier and tucked it into his jacket with his jaw tight. She'd been trained to read what people didn't say. In surgery, what the patient wasn't telling you was often more important than what they were. After dinner, she helped clear the table. Kalen objected initially, started to tell her she didn't need to, and she looked at him levelly until he stopped talking. She did it because it was her kitchen now, too, for however long she was here, and she wasn't going to sit while someone else worked. That wasn't how she operated. Cassian watched this small exchange from near the fire. She caught his expression, once thoughtful, and something that might have been the start of reassessment, the first shift in how he'd categorized her. She was glad. She'd rather be understood correctly than comfortably. That night, they gave her the small back room with its narrow bunk and a wool curtain for a door. It wasn't much. She'd slept in worse places, on cots, in army tents with artillery in the distance, and the constant sounds of men in pain around her. This was quiet and warm. And hers, at least, for now. She lay on the bunk and listened to the blizzard, and thought about the contract in her coat. The man it had been written for was someone she'd never seen. She'd agreed to the arrangement, sight unseen, through a broker, because she'd needed to disappear from Boston in a hurry, and a legal document with a frontier destination was the best cover she could construct. Whether she actually went through with it when the time came, that was a question she'd been able to defer until the weather cleared. Except now the wagon was wrecked, and the driver was dead, and there were hired guns somewhere in those trees. And she had a strong suspicion that none of it was coincidence. She thought about Bartholomew Mercer, and then deliberately stopped thinking about him, because there was nothing useful she could do about him tonight, in the middle of a blizzard on a mountain in Montana. And she'd learned that spending fear on things you couldn't act on was a waste of a resource you might need later. What she could do tonight was rest, recover fully, keep her mind sharp. She pulled the blanket up and closed her eyes and let the sound of the fire and the storm blur together until she was somewhere between awake and asleep. The way she'd trained herself to rest in field conditions, not fully gone, but far enough down to actually heal. Outside, the snow kept coming. In the main room, she could hear the low murmur of the brothers' voices, too quiet to make out the words. She didn't need to yet. She'd made her position clear, and they'd accepted it. That was more than she'd expected from anyone in a long time. Whether it held, whether Cassian's promise was the kind that lasted past the first inconvenience she'd find out. She always found out. She just paid attention and gave it time, and the truth of a person eventually came to the surface, for good or for worse. Storm Ridge pressed in cold and white around the cabin. Inside, the fire burned steady. Thalia Vance slept, and for the first time, in longer than she could cleanly remember, nobody in the building wanted anything from her that she hadn't offered. That was not a small thing. She knew exactly how small it should have felt, and how large it actually was. She held on to it and let herself sleep. 3 weeks into her stay at Storm Ridge, Thalia had stopped counting the days. It happened gradually. The first week, she'd kept close track Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday marking, timed the way you did when you were somewhere temporary, somewhere you expected to leave soon. By the second week, she'd stopped reaching for the count automatically. By the third, the rhythm of the ranch had simply absorbed her, the way any strong current eventually absorbed everything that fell into it. The blizzard had broken 8 days after she arrived. The trail had cleared enough for passage 4 days after that. She hadn't left. She told herself it was practical. The man whose name was on the contract had sent no word, no inquiry about the wrecked wagon, no search party for his intended bride. Either he didn't know yet, or he didn't care. Either way, she was in no hurry to walk towards someone who might receive news of her near death with a shrug. And the Delaney Ranch needed her. That wasn't flattery, it was just true. 3 men who were very good at surviving had almost no systems in place for anything beyond surviving, and Thalia had spent years building exactly those systems under impossible conditions. So she stayed. She reorganized the medical kit into a proper field setup. She worked out a rotation for the food stores that would stretch their supplies further into spring. She started teaching Kalen bookkeeping in the evenings, sitting across the table from him with the ranch's water-stained ledger between them, walking him through the columns patiently, while he frowned at the numbers like they'd personally offended him. Rowan hunted. Cassian worked the forge and the fence lines. Kalen busted horses when the weather allowed and complained about the ledger lessons when it didn't. And slowly, without anyone announcing it, the 4 of them started to function like something more than strangers sharing a roof. The first real thaw came in late October, a brief warm spell that softened the snow and turned the ground underneath into mud. Cassian used it immediately. There were fence lines down along the northern pasture from the storm, and livestock didn't care about weather when there was a gap to wander through. He took Rowan and Thalia with him that morning. Not because he needed Thalia specifically, but she'd asked to come, and he'd told her she could, and neither of them had made a larger thing of it than that. Mercer's men had been visible twice in the past 10 days' riders along the upper tree line, not close enough to confront, far enough to be deniable. Cassian had seen them both times. So had Rowan. They hadn't told Thalia yet, because they were still deciding what it meant, and he didn't want to alarm her without information to go with the alarm. He should have told her. Anyway, he'd think about that later. The morning was cold but bearable, with a low white sky and a weak sun behind it that gave light without warmth. The snow along the northern fence was uneven, deep in drifts against the posts, thin and crusted in the open stretches. They moved along the fence line steadily, checking each section, pulling down wire back up, and driving posts that had heaved in the freeze. Thalia worked alongside them. She wasn't trained for fence repair, but she was trained for following instruction without ego, and she paid attention and learned quickly and didn't complain about the cold or the mud or the weight of the wire. Rowan watched her work with his usual quiet assessment and eventually started directing her to the anchor post tasks, which required precision over raw strength. She was good at precision. They were midway along the northern stretch, working through a thick stand of dead brush that had collected against the fence and needed to be cleared before the wire could be retensioned, when Cassian pulled back a heavy section of dried brush with his gloved hand and stepped over the wire. He didn't see the snake until it moved. It had been coiled low in the hollow under the brush, deep enough in the dry debris that the cold hadn't reached it yet, or hadn't reached it fully. Timber rattlesnakes could sit dormant in the cold and wake up unpredictably in a thaw. Every rancher in Montana knew that. Knowing, it didn't always help you. It struck fast, the way they always did, no warning beyond the single dry rattle that came at almost exactly the same moment as the bite, which meant the warning was useless. The fangs caught him in the inner upper thigh, high up where the brush had pulled his trousers tight and the heavy denim had creased, and given the snake a surface it could reach. He felt it immediately, a deep, burning puncture, sharp enough to cut through the cold. He looked down. The snake dropped back into the brush, disappearing. Rowan was beside him in 3 steps. He'd heard the rattle. "Where?" Rowan said. Not a question. He was already looking. Upper thigh. High. Cassian kept his voice steady with the practice of a man who'd learned how to manage his own reaction to pain before he let anyone else see it. Femoral side. Rowan's face didn't change, but his jaw set. The femoral artery ran through the inner upper thigh. A severe envenomation close to a major artery meant the venom moved faster. It meant the window for intervention was shorter. They both knew this without saying it. Thalia had come around the fence post. She'd heard the rattle, too. She was looking at Cassian with her full attention, reading him the way she read patients fast, comprehensive, everything at once. "Sit down," she said. "Right now. Don't walk on it." He lowered himself to the ground, and the effort of doing it slowly, when his body wanted to react to the burning, was considerable. She was already kneeling beside him, hands on the fence post for balance in the mud, and she pulled back the edge of his trousers carefully to see the bite site. 2 puncture marks, already swelling around the margins, an inch apart. She looked up at Rowan. "How far is the nearest doctor?" 2 days, Rowan said. She looked back at the wound. Then she looked at Cassian. "I can treat this," she said. "Right here. I need my kit, Rowan. Go back and get the medical crate. Run. Don't walk." She was already unpinning her outer coat, pulling the inner one aside to get to the leather fold at her sleeve. "Cassian, I need you to stay still and stay calm. Both of those things matter. Your heart rate affects how fast this spreads." "I know," he said. "Good." She had the scalpel in her hand. She was looking at the bite site again, tilting it in the weak morning light to assess the depth and angle of the punctures. "The venom needs to come out. I'm going to make a small incision over the bite marks and extract it." "I've done this before." He said nothing for a moment. She could see him processing it, not doubting her exactly. But the location was what it was. High on the inner thigh. Exactly where you didn't readily allow strangers access. He started to shift, some instinct to handle it himself, and she put her hand firmly on his leg above the bite to stop the movement. "Don't." Her grip was sure. She looked him directly in the eye. "I know this is uncomfortable. I don't care about uncomfortable when a man's life is sitting on the other side of it. The femoral artery is right here." She held his gaze. "I'm your wife on these papers. Can I suck it?" He stared at her. She stared back, flat, focused, absolutely certain. He let out a long breath through his teeth and lay back and looked at the white sky. "Do what you need to do," he said. She worked fast. The incision was small and precise. She'd kept the scalpel clean that morning, a habit she maintained without thinking about it, and the blade cut cleanly over the first puncture mark, and then the second, opening the tissue just enough to access the venom deposit without doing unnecessary damage. She knew exactly how deep to go. She'd learned this, not from textbooks alone, but from 2 years of watching surgeons in field conditions make decisions with incomplete information and insufficient tools, and then doing it herself when no one more qualified was available. She applied her mouth to the wound and drew, pulling hard and spitting, drawing the dark fluid out in stages, careful and methodical, checking between each application. Venom extraction this way was imperfect. She knew the medical debate around it, had heard it from older surgeons who went back and forth on its usefulness. But the concentration at the bite site in the first minutes was the highest it would be, and the alternative was a 2-day ride to a doctor, with the toxin moving through him the whole way. She did it 3 more times. Then she cleaned the wound with the small amount of carbolic acid she'd brought in her kit. Always bring your kit. She'd learned that lesson the first time she hadn't, and pressed clean bandage cloth against it with steady pressure. "Keep still," she said. "Still," he repeated, from between his teeth. He was sweating despite the cold. The toxin was already moving. She could see it in the tension through his legs, the early signs of muscle involvement. Rowan came back at a run with the crate. Together, they worked through the next stage. She had him prop Cassian's leg elevated, reducing blood pooling. She checked his pulse at intervals elevated, as expected. She watched his breathing and the color around his lips for signs of systemic reaction. She had nothing to counteract the venom pharmaceutically, but she could manage the symptoms, support his body's own response, and, most importantly, she could keep him calm and immobile, which was exactly what the situation required. "Talk to me," she told Cassian. "Tell me about the ranch." He looked at her. He was working to keep his face neutral, but the pain was there, deep behind his eyes. "What about it?" he said. "Anything. When your family built it. How long you've been running it. I don't care what. Just talk." She wanted his focus outward. She wanted his breathing steady and his mind occupied rather than running ahead to the worst possibilities. Because fear raised heart rate, and heart rate was currently the enemy. He talked, haltingly at first, and then with more fluency as the habit of it took hold. He told her the ranch had been built by his father over 6 years, starting with just the cabin structure and 1 acre of cleared land. He told her his mother had planted the herb bundles that still hung from the ceiling, that she'd known every plant on the mountain by name and use. He told her she'd died in the winter of '78. The same year, his father's heart gave out the following spring, and the 3 brothers had looked at each other across their parents' graves and made a decision without words. They'd stay. They'd hold it, whatever it took. "You have," Thalia said, checking his pulse again. "Better." The rate had steadied somewhat. "For now," he said. She looked at him. There was something underneath those 2 words that she filed away for later. Rowan sat on the ground nearby, not hovering, but present, watching the tree line the way he always watched it, and watching his brother, and not making a performance of either. Kaylin was at the ranch. She thought about sending Rowan to get him, and then decided against it. She needed Rowan here, and splitting their attention wasn't useful. Kaylin would know something had happened when they came back with Cassian between them. It took most of the morning. She monitored him for 2 hours on the cold ground before she felt confident enough to move him, checking for the escalation of symptoms that would tell her the venom load had been too much for extraction and systemic treatment was failing. It didn't come. The spasms that had begun in his thigh muscles during the first 20 minutes gradually reduced in intensity. His pulse came down. His color stayed reasonable. She had gotten most of it. Rowan and Thalia walked Cassian back to the ranch between them, one on each side, Cassian's arms across their shoulders. He was heavier than she'd expected, which was a silly thing to think about under the circumstances, and she thought it anyway. He kept his weight off them as much as he could manage, which told her something about him. Even in this condition, he was trying not to be a burden. She thought about that for a moment while they walked. A man who'd been carrying everything for so long that he'd forgotten how to lean on anyone without feeling like he was failing at something. Kaylin saw them coming from the porch and was off it before they reached the fence gate. He took Cassian's other side without questions, bearing the weight easily, and when they got inside, he helped lower his brother onto the bed with a care that was entirely at odds with his usual loud energy. He stood back and looked at Thalia. "Snake," she said. "Timber rattler. High on the inner thigh, close to the femoral. I extracted the venom and treated the wound. He needs rest and monitoring for the next 24 hours, but I believe we caught it in time." Kalen stared at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Cassian on the bed. "She's serious," Cassian said to the ceiling. "She did it. Saved my life." Kalen looked back at Thalia. Something moved through his expression, not quite surprise, because he'd already stopped being advertised by her. Something more like a recalibration. The picture of who she was shifting again to make room for new information. "Thank you," he said. 2 words, but he meant all of them. She nodded and turned back to her patient. She kept watch over Cassian through the rest of the day, and into the evening, checking him at regular intervals, updating her assessment each time. His body was fighting and winning. By afternoon, the swelling around the bite had reduced significantly. By early evening, his temperature had stabilized, and the muscle spasms had stopped entirely. He slept, eventually, deeply the way people slept when they'd been holding themselves rigid for hours, and finally ran out of the energy to keep doing it. She sat in the chair beside the bed in the back room. She had a candle and one of the almanacs from the shelf, and she read without absorbing much of it, because most of her attention was on the sound of his breathing and what it told her. Rowan came in around 9 o'clock, quiet as always, and stood at the door. "He'll be fine," she said, without looking up. "I know," Rowan said. "I could see it in how you were holding yourself out there. When you're really worried about a patient, do you get more tense or less?" She looked at him. It was an unexpectedly perceptive question. "Less," she said. "I get very calm when I'm afraid. It's when I'm not afraid that I move normal." He nodded, like this confirmed something he'd already suspected. "You got less tense after about 40 minutes, he said. "I figured we were going to be all right." She held his gaze for a moment. Sharp-eyed. He'd called it exactly right. "Get some sleep," she said. "I'll stay with him tonight." Rowan didn't argue. He pulled the curtain door closed behind him. She set the almanac down and looked at Cassian's sleeping face. The scar caught the candlelight on his left side, all that pale, uneven skin running jaw to shoulder. He'd been ashamed of it. She'd noticed the way he angled that side away in company, the way he sat with the scarred side toward the wall when he could. She looked at it now without flinching, and she thought about how strange it was that the things a person was most ashamed of were so often the things that said the least about their actual worth. The candle burned down a quarter of an inch. Cassian's breathing held steady through the dark. Outside, the thaw continued quietly, the snow line, pulling back up the mountain inch by inch, and Storm Ridge settled into the particular silence of a cold night with no wind. Stars very sharp and very far above the log roof. Thalia Vance sat in her chair and kept watch, and when dawn came pale and still through the gap in the curtain, Cassian Delaney opened his eyes and was still alive, and she allowed herself, quietly and privately, to feel the full weight of what that meant. She'd saved him, out in the field, with a scalpel and her own hands, and the knowledge she'd spent years building under conditions that were designed to break her. She'd carried that knowledge across a continent, through Boston, through a frozen wagon in a Montana blizzard, and here it was. Still useful, still hers. She put the almanac on the shelf and went to make coffee. The morning after Cassian's fever broke, Thalia found him sitting up in bed, trying to pull his boot on by himself. She stood in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee and watched him for a moment. He had the boot halfway up his foot, his jaw set, his whole body doing that thing she'd already learned to recognize in him, locked down tight, working against pain, without acknowledging it existed. "Stop," she said. He stopped. She walked over and set both cups on the small table beside the bed. She crouched down, took the boot from his hands with no preamble, and finished pulling it on for him. He said nothing. She could feel the resistance in him, the automatic discomfort of being helped, but he let her do it. That was something new. She handed him his coffee and sat back in the chair. "You need 3 more days off the leg," she said. "There's work. There's always work. The fence will wait." He looked at his cup. The scar on the left side of his face caught the pale morning light coming through the gap in the curtain, silver and uneven against the darker skin. She'd stopped noticing it, mostly. Not because it wasn't there, but because it had ceased to be the first thing her eyes went to when she looked at him. A few weeks of watching a man work, talk, and make decisions did that. You stopped seeing the surface and started seeing the structure underneath. Rowan and Kalen can manage the north pasture, she said. You know that. I know, he said, quietly, like admitting it cost him something. She drank her coffee and let the silence sit, because silence with Cassian was never uncomfortable. It was just the medium he moved through most naturally. She'd figured that out early. After a while, he said, You sat with me all night. I did. You didn't have to. I'm aware of that. He turned his cup in his hands. I don't remember everything I said. When the fever was high. You talked about your mother's herb garden, she said, and a horse you had when you were 12 that you named something you wouldn't tell me clearly because the fever made it hard to follow. And you said your father's hands were the largest hands you'd ever seen on a human being, and that he could pick up a whole anvil. Cassian was quiet for a beat. I did say that. His hands were remarkable. They were, he said. A small thing moved through his face there and gone. He could have been anything. He came out here and built this instead. He looked at the wall. I've never been sure if that was courage or stubbornness. Could be both, Thalia said. Usually is. He looked at her then, directly. In that way he had full attention, not glancing. You're staying, he said. It wasn't a question. Until I have a reason to go, she said. He nodded once, and that was the end of the conversation about it, and she thought it was probably the most settled either of them had felt about the arrangement since she'd arrived. She left him to his coffee and went to find Kekelen. He was in the corral. There were 2 horses in there with him, both young, both still unpredictable in the particular way of animals that had been handled, but not yet fully trusted humans enough to relax. Kalen moved around them with an ease that looked effortless, but wasn't she could see the small adjustments he made constantly, the angle of his body, where he put his hands, how fast or slow he turned. He was thinking hard about every move. He just made it look like instinct. She climbed to sit on the top rail of the fence and watched. He noticed her after a minute and came over, leaving the horses to stand. How is he? Sitting up and arguing about work, she said. So he'll live. Kalen laughed, short and real. That's how you know Cassian's fine. He's miserable when he's fine. He's more comfortable with hardship than comfort, she said. Kalen leaned against the fence post, squinting out at the horses. The thaw had held for another day, and the air smelled like mud and cold water and pine. It was almost pleasant if you were dressed for it, which Thalia had learned to be. Can you teach me? She said. The horses. He looked at her. You want to ride? I want to know what you know, she said. I don't like being the only person on this ranch who can't handle a horse in an emergency. He considered this for a moment. She had the sense he was deciding whether to treat it as a casual request or a serious one. He must have landed on serious, because he nodded and straightened up. All right, he said. Get down off the fence. She got down. He spent the better part of the morning showing her the basics, and she learned quickly that what looked simple from outside the corral was genuinely complex from inside it. A horse read you before you read it. It picked up tension, hesitation, uncertainty, all the things you thought you were hiding. You couldn't fake calm with a horse. It knew. You're in your head, Kalen told her. He wasn't unkind about it, just factual. Stop thinking about doing it right. Just do it. That's not useful instruction, I know. It doesn't work until it does. He positioned himself beside her, close enough to step in if needed. Try again. Walk toward her from the side. Not straight on, you're not a threat, but you're also not a wall. She tried again. The horse shifted, uncertain. Thalia kept her breath slow. There, Kalen said. That? Whatever you just did with your breathing. Hold that. She held it. The horse settled. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a sudden breakthrough. The horse just stopped moving and let her get close, and Thalia placed her palm flat against the animal's neck and stood there while the warmth of it came through her glove. Good, Kalen said, from somewhere behind her. His voice had dropped, the way it always did around spooked things, patient and quiet and absolutely sure. See? She's talking to you. She's not talking, Thalia said. She's talking. You just got to learn the language. She stayed with the horse for another few minutes, letting it get used to her hand, and she thought about what Kalen meant. There was a language to it. Small movements, small sounds, the way The animal's breathing changed. It wasn't so different from reading a patient, really. You paid attention to the things that weren't words. She thought she might actually be able to learn this. They went inside at noon. Rowan had already come back from the tree line with 2 rabbits and started a stew without being asked, moving through the kitchen space with the same focused economy he brought to everything. He noticed Thalia's coat, which had picked up a long smear of something brown from the corral fence. "Horses?" he said. "Kalen's teaching me," she said. Rowan looked at Kalen with an expression she couldn't entirely decode, something somewhere between approval and amusement. He turned back to the stove. "She's got a good hand," Kalen said, hanging his coat by the door. "Natural." "I'm not natural yet," Thalia said. "You'll be natural by spring." She went to check on Cassian. He'd made it to the table under his own power, which meant he'd ignored her instruction about the leg and walked on it anyway. And she stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at him with the particular expression she reserved for patients who did exactly this. He must have felt it, because he said, without looking up from the book he was reading, "The leg is fine." "I didn't say anything. You're about to." She sat down across from him. She pulled the ranch ledger toward her, which had been sitting at the far end of the table since she'd first picked it up 3 weeks ago. She'd had Kalen bring it to the table every evening after dinner, trying to make it a habit. Progress had been slow. Numbers weren't Kalen's native language, and his instinct when something confused him was to become loudly contemptuous of it, rather than sit with the confusion until it cleared. That evening was no different. Kalen came to the table after dinner with the expression of a man walking towards something he'd rather avoid. He dropped into the chair across from Thalia and looked at the ledger like it had wronged him personally. "Where did we leave off?" he said. "The cattle sale column," she said. "The one you've been avoiding for 4 days." "I haven't been avoiding it." She gave him a flat look. "I've been busy," he said. "Kellen?" "Fine." He pulled the ledger toward him. "Show me again." She walked him through it. The basic principle wasn't complicated. Income on the left, expenditure on the right, balance in the middle column. What made it complicated was what it revealed. When you laid the ranch's finances out in clean columns, the picture was harder to ignore than when the numbers lived in your head in a loose, optimistic arrangement. Kalen could feel the difference, and it made him restless. "This is what you spend per month on feed," she said, pointing. "This is what you make on an average cattle sale. The gap between those two numbers is the problem." He stared at the columns. "I knew it was bad. Knowing it's bad and seeing exactly how bad are different things. I'm starting to think you might be the most relentless person I've ever met." "In my experience, uncleansed rooms give cheaters room to operate," she said. "A cattle trader who knows you, don't track your accounts carefully, will give you whatever price he decides you deserve. If you can walk into a trade meeting and say exactly what your herd is worth and exactly what you'll accept, he has less room to move." Kalen looked at her for a moment. Something settled in his face. "Mercer's man shorted us last spring," he said, "on a sale of 18 head. Cassian argued it, but he couldn't prove the number was wrong because we didn't have the records laid out clean enough." "That's what I thought," she said. "It's not that you don't have the information. You just haven't been keeping it in a form that lets you use it." He looked at the ledger again, differently this time. "Show me the cattle column again," he said. She showed him. Across the room, Cassian sat near the fire with his book, which he'd stopped reading at some point in the last 10 minutes. He was just sitting now, watching the fire or watching the table. She couldn't tell which, without looking at him directly, and she didn't look. She could feel his attention, though. She'd gotten good at that. Rowan was on the far side of the room, cleaning a rifle with methodical care, laying the parts out on a cloth in the order he'd disassemble them. He didn't join the ledger lesson, but he wasn't outside himself either. He was in the room, and the room held all of them, and that was a thing she'd noticed lately. They had started to exist in the same spaces without needing to perform occupation of them. People who were comfortable together could be in the same room doing different things. People who weren't comfortable with each other needed something to do or someone to look at. The Delaney brothers had started to be comfortable with her, the way she was already comfortable with them, and that was a kind of progress that didn't announce itself. After a while, Kalen pushed back from the ledger and stretched his arms over his head, a physical creature who processed stress through his body first and his mind after. My father never kept books, he said. Not complaint, just information. I know, she said. Rowan told me he built the ranch over 6 years, starting with 1 cleared acre. That kind of man usually runs on instinct and luck. It worked for him, it did. But the frontier is changing. The men who are coming in now aren't homesteaders. They're businessmen. They know how to use paper the way you know how to use a lasso. She paused. Paper is a tool. You should know how to use it. Kalen was quiet for a moment, and she could see him turning that over. He processed things by arguing first. But when the argument ran out and something was actually true, he got quiet and absorbed it. She'd learned that about him. You're not angry about the books, he said slowly. You're angry about Mercer's man. She looked at him. I've watched a lot of men lose things they should have been able to keep because they didn't know how to read a contract or balance a column. Yes, it makes me angry. He nodded slowly. All right, he said. Show me the income projection column. The one I keep skipping, she showed him. That night, after the brothers had gone to bed, she sat at the table alone with the ledger and went through the numbers herself, more carefully than she'd shown Kalen, making her own notes on a spare piece of paper. The ranch was genuinely struggling. She'd known it since that first look at the supply shelves, but the ledger made it concrete. 6 months, maybe 7, before they were in real trouble, and that was assuming a good spring cattle price, and no significant losses to weather or predators, neither of which was guaranteed in Montana. She put her pen down and looked at what she'd written. She had knowledge that could help with this. Not money she didn't have money, but things that substituted for it in small ways. Medical remedies she could compound and sell to the mining camps. Organizational systems that reduced waste. She'd been trained in conditions where you had to make something out of almost nothing. And this was not nothing. This was 3 capable men, 1 working ranch, and 1 very bad winter. She folded her notes and put them in her coat pocket for the morning. She was almost to the back room when she heard the sound. It was quiet. Just a few notes of something low and rough, like a man humming or speaking to himself, half-conscious. She stopped. It was coming from outside the cabin. She got her coat and her scalpel out of habit, and she pushed the front door open a few inches. Cassian was on the porch. He was standing at the rail with his bad leg braced against the step, looking out at the dark tree line. The sky above Storm Ridge was absolutely clear for once, the kind of cold clear that happened when the temperature dropped below everything, and the stars were so dense and bright they looked wrong, like something painted on. He wasn't looking at the stars. He was looking at the trees, which was where Mercer's men had been riding. She stepped out and stood beside him. She didn't say anything. After a minute, he said, "Couldn't sleep." "I know," she said. "I heard you." He turned the rail under his hands. The scar on his face was very pale in the starlight, moon-white against the dark skin around it. He'd angled slightly so it was facing away from her, and she moved, casually, to put herself on his left side. He stiffened almost imperceptibly, then went still. "You don't have to do that," she said. "What?" "Turn it away," she said it simply. Not gently exactly, but without any edge in it. Just the truth, stated clearly. "I've seen it. I'm not going to unsee it. And it doesn't change what I see when I look at you." A long silence. "What do you see?" he said. Not challenging, genuinely asking, which told her how much that cost him. "A man who's been carrying too much for too long," she said, "and who's very bad at asking for help, which I suspect is related to the same wound." He looked at the tree line. His hands were still on the rail. "The fire," he said, 3 years ago. I wasn't paying attention. That's all it was. It wasn't heroic, and it wasn't interesting. I just wasn't paying attention. Most injuries aren't heroic, she said. Most injuries are just the moment when something went wrong. He was quiet again. She waited. I don't sleep much, he said, since the war. I close my eyes, and there's too much noise in there. She thought about what to say, and she decided not to say much. There were certain kinds of pain that didn't need guidance or reassurance. They just needed someone to stand next to them in the cold without looking away. I've been on this porch more nights than I can count, he said, just standing here, waiting for the quiet to come back. Does it? Sometimes. He looked up at the stars. Nights like this, clear nights. She stood beside him for a while. Neither of them spoke. The cold was hard and clean around them, and above the ridge the stars held steady, and somewhere in the trees a single owl called once and then went silent. Eventually, she said, "Come inside. Your leg needs the warmth." He came inside. She heated the coffee that had been sitting on the back of the stove and gave him a cup. And he sat at the table, and she sat across from him. And they talked, actually. Talked for maybe an hour. Not about the war, not about the fire, not about Mercer, or the money problems, or anything that required solving. He told her about learning to track as a boy, following his father through the first heavy snows of autumn. She told him about her first year of medical training. The professor who'd told her she was too small to manage surgery, and whom she'd quietly and comprehensively proven wrong over the next 18 months. He listened to that with something in his eyes that she decided was the beginning of knowing her. When he finally went to bed, she sat alone at the table for a few minutes with her empty cup. The fire was burning down to coals. The cabin was full of the particular quiet of people sleeping safely, which she'd learned to recognize over years in field hospitals as a specific kind of rare gift. Not silence exactly, but the absence of crisis. She looked around the room. The herb bundles from Cassian's mother still hung from the rafters, dry and faded, but still real. The supply shelves were more organized than they'd been a month ago. The medical crate was where it needed to be, accessible and clean. On the table, the ledger sat with Kalen's handwriting in the columns, jagged and improving. She had made herself useful. She'd done it the way she always did, by finding the need and meeting it, without waiting to be asked, without making it larger than it was. That was the work. That was what she knew how to do. But something else had happened here, slowly without her engineering it. Something she didn't have a clinical word for and hadn't planned on. She put the cups in the basin and covered the coals in the stove and went to bed. Stars over Storm Ridge burned on outside the log walls, cold and enormous and indifferent to everything below them. And inside the Delaney cabin, 4 people slept through the same dark for the first time, without any of them thinking of it as strange. That was how it happened, not with an announcement, not with anyone deciding it. Just 4 people in one house, getting used to the shape of each other, learning to move around one another without collision, until the space between them started to feel less like distance and more like room. The town of Harlan's Creek sat at the bottom of the mountain, like something the mountain had coughed up and forgotten about. 2 streets, a handful of storefronts, a saloon that did more business than everything else combined. The livery was at the south end. The general store was in the middle. The sheriff's office was at the north end, which Thalia had always thought said something about priorities. She'd been there twice since arriving at Storm Ridge, both times brief, both times with Cassian or Rowan. This was the first time with Kalen, and Kalen in a town was a slightly different experience than Kalen on the ranch. He knew everyone. Not in a formal way in the way of someone who'd grown up watching his father do business here, who'd ridden this trail since he was 8 years old and had never found a reason to be shy about existing in public. He nodded to people by name. People nodded back. A woman outside the dry goods store called him something in an affectionate tone that Thalia didn't quite catch, and he grinned and tipped his hat and kept riding. "You grew up coming here," Thalia said. "Every 2 weeks, weather allowing. Pa used to let me hold the horses while he did business. He swung down at the hitching post outside the general store. Then he let me do the business while he held the horses. Then one winter, he just stopped coming." She tied her horse beside his. The sky over Harlan's Creek was the white gray of a day that couldn't make up its mind about snow low and flat, pressing the smoke from chimneys sideways. "I've got the supply list," she said. "I've got the money." He patted his coat pocket. "What's left of it?" The general store was warm inside, smelling of sawdust and salt, and the particular combination of dry goods stored close together in a small space. The storekeeper, a compact man named Briggs, who wore the same gray apron every time she'd seen him, was tallying figures behind the counter. He looked up when they came in, Delaney. He nodded at Kalen, then at Thalia. "Miss Vance Briggs," Kalen said. "We've got a list." Thalia handed the paper across the counter. Briggs read it without expression, which told her he'd learned early in his career to keep his reactions off his face when customers were watching. "I can do most of this," he said. "The carbolic acid, I'm low on. I can do a half measure now and hold the other half for your next run." "That's fine," she said. She'd expected that. She'd started ordering ahead, anticipating the partial shipments, so the ranch never ran fully short of anything critical. Another thing she'd learned from Army supply chains, the shortage wasn't the emergency. The shortage you hadn't planned for was. While Briggs pulled the order, Thalia moved along the store shelves, making her own assessment of what was available, what was priced fairly, what might be useful that wasn't on the list. She'd added 2 items herself. Before Kalen finished paying a ball of heavy twine that would serve a dozen purposes and a tin of pine tar salve that worked on both horses and humans, which on a working ranch made it twice as useful per coin spent. Kalen didn't question either addition. He'd stopped questioning her purchasing decisions after the second week, when she'd come back from town with a particular kind of gut thread and used it to close a bad cut on Rowan's palm so cleanly that by the following week it was barely a scar. They loaded the supplies into the saddlebags. The horses were patient. The street was quiet in the way. Small towns went quiet in late November, not empty, just reduced to the people who had real business outside and no option to stay indoors. It was Kalen who saw him first. She knew, because she saw Kalen's body change. He'd been tying a knot in the saddlebag strap, easy and relaxed, and then something shifted and he went still. His hands kept moving, completing the knot, but the relaxed part was gone. He straightened up slowly. "Thalia," he said quietly, "don't turn around fast." She didn't. She turned around the same way she moved in a hospital ward when she didn't want to alarm a patient, calmly, with purpose, like she'd intended to turn around at exactly that moment. There were 3 men standing across the street. 2 of them she didn't know. Large men, both of them, wearing the kind of clothes that said hired rather than working. They held themselves the way. Guards held themselves at attention, but with the laziness of men who expected the threat to go their way. The third man she knew. He hadn't changed much. He never did. Bartholomew Mercer, at 42, looked exactly as he had at 35, and probably looked exactly as he had at 28. Immaculate, considered, carrying himself with the specific self-assurance of a man who had never in his adult life encountered a problem his money couldn't outlast. He was tall, dressed in a dark coat that cost more than most people in Harlan's Creek made in a season, and he was looking at her with an expression that wasn't quite a smile, but carried all the satisfaction of one. Her stomach went cold. She kept her face still. She was good at this. She'd had years of practice keeping her face still in front of him. He crossed the street. His men stayed where they were. He stopped 6 feet from her, which was calculated, close enough to be personal, far enough to look like a social call. "Miss Vance," he said. His voice was the same, too. Smooth, even. The voice of a man who'd never had to raise it to get what he wanted. What an extraordinary coincidence. "Mercer?" she said. He glanced at Kalen with the brief, dismissive assessment of a man who priced people on sight. Kalen was watching him with no expression at all, which was unusual enough that she noticed it. Kalen always had an expression. "I've been looking for you," Mercer said, returning his attention to her, as though Kalen had already been discounted, as have the proper authorities. "You left Boston rather suddenly." "I left Boston legally," she said, "with a signed travel document and a contracted destination." "Yes, about that." He reached inside his coat and produced a folded paper. He held it toward her, not handing it, just displaying it. Theft and breach of contract, Miss Vance. Warrant issued by the Boston Municipal Court, signed by Judge Aldridge. He paused. You took property that wasn't yours when you left. I took my own medical instruments, she said, which I purchased with my own wages. Your wages were an advance against your service contract, service you failed to deliver. His voice was still even. That was the thing about Mercer. He didn't get heated. Heat was for people who weren't certain of the outcome. Under the terms of the arrangement, every instrument you purchased during the contracted period was an expenditure against services owed. By leaving, you incurred a debt. It was a lie, constructed out of real legal language, which was the most dangerous kind of lie. She'd known when she left that he might come after her this way. She'd known, and she'd left anyway, because the alternative was staying, and staying had stopped being survivable. Kalen stepped forward. One step, deliberate, putting himself slightly between her and Mercer. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't touch anything. He just moved. She's on Delaney land, he said, under Delaney protection. You want to talk law? Go talk it to our door. Mercer looked at him with the expression of a man being corrected by a piece of furniture. And you are? Kellen Delaney. My brother's ranch is up the mountain, and she's been part of our household since October. He held Mercer's gaze without blinking. This warrant of yours is from Massachusetts. You're in Montana territory. I'd be curious what your jurisdiction looks like from here. Something moved in Mercer's expression. Not surprise men like Mercer didn't surprise easily, but a recalculation. He hadn't expected the boy to know that. Jurisdictional questions are interesting things, Mercer said pleasantly. They can take a long time to resolve. In the meantime, a woman under fraudulent warrant can find her movements considerably restricted. The warrant is fraudulent, Thalia said. She said it clearly, so if anyone was close enough to hear, they heard it plainly. And you know it. Mercer folded the paper and put it back in his coat. I know what Judge Aldridge signed, he said. That tends to be what matters. He looked at her for a moment with the patient certainty of a man who believed time moved in his direction, who had always found that patience was simply the act of waiting for the world to deliver what he'd already decided was his. I'll be in Harlan's Creek for a few days, he said. I hope you'll make the practical choice, Miss Vance. You know I prefer things resolved cleanly. He turned and walked back across the street. His men fell in behind him without a word. Thalia stood absolutely still until they turned the corner beside the saloon and were gone. Then she exhaled. Kalen was beside her. He didn't say anything for a moment, just stood there, being physically present in the way he did when he understood that presence was what was needed. He followed me. Here, she said. Yeah? Kalen looked at the corner where Mercer had disappeared. From Boston. He doesn't give up on things he's decided are his. She looked at her hands. They were steady. She was faintly surprised. I knew this was a possibility. I planned for this being a possibility. But knowing and seeing are different things, Kalen said. It was almost exactly what she'd said to him about the ledger 3 weeks ago, and he said it without appearing to notice. Yes, she said. They are. They rode back up the mountain faster than they'd come down. Cassian was at the forge when they returned. He came out when he heard the horses, took one look at Thalia's face, and sent Kalen inside to get Rowan. They stood in the main room, all 4 of them, and Thalia laid it out plainly. Everything Mercer had said, word for word, in the order he'd said it. The warrant, the claimed debt, the legal language wrapped around a manufactured accusation. She didn't editorialize. She presented it as she would present symptoms to a surgeon clearly, in sequence, with nothing left out and nothing added. Cassian listened without interrupting. Rowan stood against the wall with his arms crossed, the way he did when he was thinking hard, and wanted his hands still so his mind could work. Kalen sat on the edge of the table, and the restless energy that usually ran through him was gone, replaced by something steady and fixed. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. The warrant, Rowan said. It's fraudulent. Yes. Can you prove that? I have documentation of the purchase of my instruments. I have wage records. Or I brought copies. She crossed to the back room and came back with the oilskin document case. She found the papers, folded small and tucked behind the contract. Here, purchase dates, amounts, employer signatures. The instruments were bought with wages, not advances. Rowan took the papers and read through them carefully, the way he read everything, not fast, but complete. "This is solid," he said. "It's solid against the truth," she said. "Mercer doesn't need the truth. He needs time and legal confusion and a judge he's already paid for. He can tie this up in territorial courts for months. And while it's tied up, the warrant limits my movement and gives him leverage." Cassian, who had been standing near the fire, said, "He's been watching this ranch." "I know," she said. "The riders in the tree line." He looked at her. "You saw them 2 weeks ago." "I didn't say anything because I wasn't certain what they were watching for, and I didn't want to assume." A beat of silence. "Neither did we," Cassian said. He said it without apology, but with the weight of someone acknowledging that they'd both been carrying the same stone in the same pocket for the same reason. "Told you. We all should have talked," she said. Rowan set the papers down on the table. "He came all the way from Boston. This isn't just about the warrant." "No," she said. "He doesn't travel for small problems. He travels when he's decided something." "Then why come in person?" Kalen said. "Why not just send more men?" It was Cassian who answered. His voice was slow, thinking it through as he went. "Because this isn't just about her. He wants her to see him. He wants her to know he can reach her anywhere she goes." He looked at Thalia. "That's how men like this work. The arrest warrant is a tool. What he really wants is for you to stop running and come back." She said nothing, because he was right, and they all knew he was right, and saying so out loud didn't change it. The knock at the door came the following evening. Not a casual knock. A knock with authority behind it, the kind that expected to be answered fast. Cassian opened it. One of Mercer's men stood on the porch, the larger of the two from town. He held a sealed envelope and nothing else, and he held it the way people held things when they wanted to make clear they were a messenger and not the message. "From Mr. Mercer," the man said, "for the Delaney household." Cassian took it, closed the door, brought it to the table. They opened it together. It was 2 documents. The first was a legal cover letter, written in the formal language of a business communication, signed by Mercer at the bottom, in a signature that managed to look both elegant and aggressive at once. The second document was the one that changed everything. It was a mortgage deed. Rowan picked it up first. He read it through once, and when he set it down, his face had gone very still. "He bought the debt," Rowan said. "What?" Kalen stood up. "The bank in Billings. The mortgage on this land." Rowan set the paper flat on the table and smoothed it with his hand, as though the gesture might change the text. "2 months ago, he bought the note from the bank. We've been making payments to a bank that transferred our debt to Bartholomew Mercer without notifying us." The room was silent. Thalia picked up the cover letter and read it carefully from the beginning. She read it twice because legal documents rewarded careful reading, and she'd learned to never skim anything with a seal on it. The letter was clear. It was precise. It was the work of lawyers who knew exactly what they were doing and had done it without leaving an opening. Mercer's terms were laid out at the bottom of the page. 3 lines that sat there like stones, dropped into still water. 5 days, $10,000 in gold bullion paid in full, or the mortgage was called. The land was foreclosed. All 3 Delaney brothers would be subject to arrest under charges of debt fraud, and Thalia would be returned to Boston to face the standing warrant. She set the letter down. $10,000 in 5 days, on a ranch that had been worried about hay and flour. Kalen had read it over her shoulder. He was standing very still, which was the most frightening thing she'd seen him do, because Kalen standing still meant something had hit him hard enough to stop him. Cassian hadn't moved from where he stood at the end of the table. He'd read the documents when Rowan passed them, and then he'd stood there and looked at the fire. And his face had the expression of a man calculating something he didn't want the numbers to add up to. "He planned this," Rowan said. "He bought the debt before he came here. This wasn't improvised." "No," Thalia said. "He'd have started this process when I left Boston. He knew where I was going, the broker in Philadelphia. He could have gotten that from any number of people." She pressed her palms flat on the table. "He spent 2 months building this before he showed his face." $10,000, Kalen said. He said it quietly, which was wrong. It should have been said loudly, the way Kalen said everything that outraged him. That he said it quietly told her how deep it had landed. 5 days, Rowan said. Cassian turned from the fire. We don't have 10,000, nobody answered that, because there was nothing to answer. He looked at Thalia. You knew what kind of man he was when you left. Yes, and you came anyway. I ran, she said, because staying was worse. I knew there was a risk he'd follow. I took it. She didn't look away. I'm not going to apologize for leaving, Cassian, but I understand if this changes things. He held her gaze for a long moment. It doesn't change things, he said. It changes what we have to do. The fire popped. The wind had come up again outside, not a storm yet, but the beginning of one working its way down off the upper ridge in cold gusts that found the gaps in the log walls. They sat up for 2 hours, going through options. Real ones. Not wishes. Cassian talked to each possibility in turn, the way a man who'd commanded scouts did methodically, discarding what didn't work and keeping what might. Rowan had the territorial law knowledge between them, enough to understand where Mercer's document was solid and where it might have soft spots. Kalen pulled out the ledger that Thalia had been teaching him to read, laid it on the table, and went through the columns himself, looking for anything that had been missed. Thalia thought about the mining camps east of the ridge. She thought about the remedies she could compound. She thought about what Rowan could pull in with the upper ridgeline pelts in a good week and what Kalen could earn in a bronc riding contest if the purses were running high. None of it added up to $10,000 in 5 days. Not even close. But it wasn't nothing. And she'd been in situations where nothing was the only starting point she had. She was about to say that. About to lay out the beginning of something that might be a plan. When the smell hit her. Smoke. Not the wood smoke of the stove, which was present in every breath inside the cabin. This was different. Outside smoke. Raw and thick, carrying something chemical in it. Dried grass, hay, the particular smell of a winter store burning. Rowan was at the window before she'd finished thinking it. He threw the shutters open. The barn was on fire. Not the main structure. The hay barn, 60 yards east of the cabin, where they'd stored the winter feed. The whole south side was already orange, bright and violent against the dark, and the wind that had been building all evening had found it and was feeding it now, pulling the fire upward in a column that was visible against the black sky. Cassian was out the door. Kalen was right behind him, and Rowan behind Kalen, and Thalia pulled her coat off the hook and ran after all of them, out into the cold and the orange light and the smell of everything burning. They fought it. Of course they fought it. They pulled water from the horse trough and threw it at the edges and tried to pull the burning sections away from what hadn't caught yet. But the hay was dry, the wind was steady, and the fire was already past the point where 3 men and 1 woman with buckets could stop it. What they could do was contain it. Keep it from jumping to the horse shelter, keep it from the supply shed, keep it from finding the cabin. They did that, all 4 of them, working in the orange heat with water and wet blankets and the particular grim focus of people who'd accepted what was lost and were protecting what wasn't. By the time it burned down to itself, Thalia's coat was scorched along one arm, and her hands were raw from the bucket rope, and her throat was rough with smoke. She stood in the cold and looked at what was left of the hay barn. Most of it was gone. The winter feed was gone. 5 months of careful storing and rationing and planning, and it was ash and blackened timber in the dirt. Cassian stood beside her. He was breathing hard, controlled, the way he breathed when he was managing something he hadn't let himself feel yet. Mercer's men, he said. It wasn't a question. Yes, she said. The 4 of them stood there in the dark, in the smell of the smoke and the cold coming down off the ridge, and the calculation was the same for all of them, even if none of them spoke it out loud. No hay, no feed for the livestock through winter, no $10,000. 5 days. Thalia looked at her burned coat sleeve and thought about what she knew and what she could do and what had been built in her long before she'd ever heard of Storm Ridge. By years, in conditions that were supposed to be impossible. She turned around and walked back to the cabin. After a moment, she heard the others follow. She put the kettle on. She got 4 cups down from the shelf. Her hands were steady. That was the thing she noticed most, standing at the stove in the smoke-smelling cabin with the light of a dead fire still faintly orange in the window glass. Her hands were steady. She was afraid, and she was angry, and she was also something else, something that had been there since the day she'd left Boston and hadn't left her yet. Ready. She poured the water and brought the cups to the table and sat down. "All right," she said. "Let's talk about what we have." Nobody slept that night. They sat at the table until the sky outside turned from black to the flat gray of early dawn, and the smell of smoke still clung to everything: their coats, their hair, the rough wood of the walls. The hay barn was gone. The winter feed was gone. The 5-day clock was running. Thalia had made coffee. She kept making it every time a cup went empty, because it gave her hands something to do, and it kept everyone at the table instead of pacing holes in the floor. Kalen was the one who finally said what all 4 of them were thinking. "We could just go up there and kill him." "No," Cassian said. "I'm not being dramatic. I'm being practical. 15 hired guns and 1 man in a fancy coat. And between the 3 of us." "No," Cassian set his cup down. "That's what he wants. He wants us angry enough to be stupid. A man shoots out Bartholomew Mercer in Montana Territory. There's a federal case before the body's cold. He's got friends in Washington. We don't." Kalen leaned back and said nothing, but the set of his jaw said he wasn't fully convinced. Rowan was looking at the papers spread on the table in front of him. The mortgage deed, the fraudulent warrant. He'd been going through them both for the better part of an hour, reading everything twice, the way he did with anything that mattered, looking for the seam. "He made a mistake," Rowan said. Everyone looked at him. "The bank fraud. When he bought the note from Billings, he was supposed to notify us within 30 days under territorial land law. He didn't." Rowan set the mortgage deed down and pointed to a date in the upper right corner. "He bought this 2 months ago. We never got notice. That's not a technicality. That's a violation of the transfer statute." "Can we use it?" Thalia asked. "Not fast enough to stop the foreclosure on its own, but it creates grounds for federal review. If we can get the right person looking at it." He stopped, looked at Cassian. Cassian was already ahead of him. "Holt, U.S. Marshal Holt," Rowan said. "He came through in September about the rustling reports north of Harlan's Creek. I talked to him. He was already watching Mercer, something about railroad land deals that didn't sit right." "Rowan," Thalia said carefully, "why didn't you say that when Mercer showed up in town?" "Because I wasn't sure it was connected," Rowan said. "Now I'm sure." She absorbed this, another thing being carried in a pocket without sharing. She thought about saying so, and then she let it go, because there was no time for it, and recriminations didn't build anything. "How long does it take to reach Holt?" she asked. "I know where he stations. 3 hours hard ride if the trail's clear. I can leave by mid-morning." He looked at Cassian. "But the evidence has to be there when he comes. He won't move on a personal claim. He needs paper." "I have paper," Thalia said. She already had the oilskin case in her hands, flipping through it. The purchase records for her instruments, the wage documentation. Then, underneath those, something she'd tucked in before she left Boston because she hadn't been sure she'd ever need it but had known better than to leave it behind. "He falsified the contract terms after I signed. I kept a copy of the original." She laid it on the table next to the mortgage deed. Cassian looked at both documents. He looked at her. "You planned ahead," he said. "I always plan ahead." She sat down. "Which is why we're not going to let him win this." The room was quiet for a moment. "One problem," Kalen said. "Holt can take Sut down, eventually, maybe, if everything goes right. But we've still got 5 days, and no money and no hay." He spread his hands. "Even if Rowan gets to Holt, and Holt believes him, and rides up here on time, we still can't pay what's on that paper. And if the livestock die from no feed before Holt arrives, then we solve both," Thalia said. She stood up and pulled the ranch ledger toward her. She opened it to the back pages, the ones she'd been using for her own notes, and she turned it so the others could see. "I need 3 things from each of you," she said. "Here's what I've been thinking." She talked for 20 minutes. She laid it out the way she'd learned to lay out surgical plans, not with hope and improvisation, but with sequence, with contingency, with a clear understanding of what failure at each stage would mean and what came next if that happened. She'd spent years working in conditions where planning was the difference between a patient making it out and a patient not making it, and she'd learned that the quality of the plan mattered more than the courage of the people executing it. The plan wasn't going to get them $10,000. Not even close, but it wasn't supposed to. That wasn't the point. Rowan understood first. She could see it in the way his eyes moved when she got to that part. He leaned forward and looked at the notes more carefully. "You're not trying to pay him off," Rowan said. "No, you're buying time and building a case. And making noise," she said. "Every dollar we put on the table in the next 5 days is noise. It says we're not running. It says we're staying and we're fighting. And we know what he did with that banknote." She looked around at all 3 of them. Mercer uses silence. When people go quiet and disappear, that's when he wins. We're going to be the opposite of quiet. Cassian had been listening without moving. He looked at the notes on the ledger page. Then he looked at her. "You said 3 things," he said. She nodded. "Rowan rides for Holt with the documents. He goes today, before Mercer knows we've identified the fraud. Speed matters." "Done," Rowan said. "Kalen." She turned to him. "There's a bronc competition running out of the Whitmore settlement, 2 days east. I looked it up last week in Briggs's copy of the territorial notice. The purse runs high in November because not many riders are willing to go out in the cold. You are." Kalen sat up straight. He was listening differently now, the kind of listening that lived in his body, the physical readiness of someone who'd just been given a real thing to do. "What's the purse?" "First place is $400. Second is $150. She met his eyes. "Ride both days. Come back with whatever you can carry." "I'll ride," he said, and she believed him completely. "Cassian," she turned to the last cup of coffee on the table and pushed it toward him. "You're the hardest one." He raised an eyebrow. "There are 11 ranchers between here and Harlan's Creek who are carrying debt they didn't ask for. 2 of them are carrying notes through the same Billings bank." She tapped the mortgage deed. "Mercer didn't just buy ours. He's been acquiring frontier land debt for 2 years. Your neighbors don't know they're standing on the same ground you are." Cassian's jaw set. She could see him turning it over, calculating. "You want me to go to them," he said. "I want you to tell them the truth. What Mercer did with our note. What he's likely done or planning to do with theirs. What a cooperative looks like if 11 ranchers stand together in front of a territorial court instead of one at a time." She paused. "A man like Mercer counts on isolation. He picks people off one by one because together they're a different kind of problem." The fire had burned low while they talked. The gray dawn had turned to the pale, thin light of a November morning, flat and cold through the cabin windows. "And your part?" Cassian asked. "I'm going to the mining camps." She was already moving toward the supply shelf, already thinking through what she had and what she could produce. "The cholera runs bad through winter camps. So does snow blindness, frostbite, infected wounds. They pay in gold for medical remedies because it's faster than riding 2 days to the nearest doctor." She pulled down the supply crate. "I have the knowledge and most of the materials. I'll compound what I can and ride east to the camps tomorrow morning." "Alone?" Kalen said. "You'll be at the Whitmore settlement," she said. "Rowan will be tracking down Holt. Cassian will be riding the valley ranches." She looked at Kalen evenly. "I'm not fragile. I've worked in field hospitals. A mining camp in November is not the most dangerous place I've walked into alone." He clearly wanted to argue this. He looked at Cassian. Cassian looked at Thalia. "She goes armed," he said. "I already carry a scalpel." "She goes with a rifle," he said. "Not a negotiation. I'll show you how to use it tonight." She could live with that. She nodded. They separated to work within the hour. Rowan packed his saddlebag with careful efficiency, selecting the documents Thalia had laid out for him, adding his own knowledge of the bank fraud timeline in a written statement she made him produce before he left. She wrote it out herself and had him verify the facts and sign it, because she knew from experience that oral accounts got lost, and written ones didn't. He was on the trail by mid-morning. Thalia spent the rest of the day at the work table with the supply crate, the small tin of carbolic acid, what remained of her personal stores, and the dried herbs from the cabin ceiling, the ones Cassian's mother had hung there, every one of them labeled in a careful hand on a small strip of cloth. She worked with total focus. She knew exactly what the mining camps needed. She'd seen it in smaller version, in army encampments, and the logic was the same. Men working close together in cold and wet, sharing tools and water sources, cuts and abrasions, that didn't get properly cleaned because there was nothing to clean them with. She compounded a livestock antiseptic strong enough to use on humans because in a mining camp, the distinction often didn't matter. She made a salve for snow blindness using tallow and a particular dried herb she recognized as eyebright. She prepared cold compresses already treated, ready to sell, sealed in cloth. She lined them up on the work table and assessed the row. Not $10,000. Not close, but they were real, and real things added together. Cassian came in from the cold late in the afternoon, having ridden to the 3 nearest valley ranchers and back. He was windburned and quiet. He sat at the table and drank water and told her what he'd found. 2 of the 3 had notes through the Billings Bank. One of them, a man named Pruitt, who ran cattle east of the lower ridge, had already gotten a letter he couldn't make full sense of, something about account restructuring. He'd been worried about it for weeks and hadn't told anyone because he thought it was just him. He thought it was just him, Cassian said. He said it like the words had weight to them. That's how it works, Thalia said. Make each person feel like they're the only one who didn't pay attention, the only one who made a mistake. That way, nobody compares notes. He looked at the row of remedies on the table. 8 more ranchers, he said. I'll ride them tomorrow. She nodded. Early, he sat there for a moment, looking at the work table, and she let him look. She wasn't done working. She had 3 more salves to finish before she could sleep. Thalia, he said. She looked up. He seemed to weigh something, then set it down without saying it, and then picked it back up. When I think about what we're up against, he said, I get a feeling in my chest, like the walls are closing in. Same feeling as the winter before my parents died, when I could see what was coming and didn't know how to stop it. She held his gaze. She didn't try to fix it or soften it. I know that feeling, she said. But you keep working. The walls closing in doesn't stop the work from being necessary, she said simply. So you do the work. He nodded slowly, like he was adding it to something he'd been building in his head for a while. That evening, after they'd eaten and the cabin had gone dark beyond the fire, she gathered the 3 of them together, Cassian there, Kalen newly returned from packing his gear for the morning ride, Rowan already gone. She stood at the end of the table and looked at both of them, and she said, the thing she'd been carrying all day in her chest, the thing that was true whether she said it out loud or not, but that needed to be said out loud because they'd earned the hearing of it. Men like Mercer believe human beings can be bought and sold with paper and gold, she said. But out here on the frontier, our worth is measured by our sweat, our honor, and how we stand by one another. I belong to no man. I belong to myself, and I choose to stand with you. Kalen looked at the table for a moment. When he looked back up, his eyes were steady in a way she didn't see from him often. Then let's not give him an inch, he said. Cassian said nothing. He just looked at her the way he'd looked at things he intended to protect for a long time. She went back to the work table. She had 3 more salves to finish. She finished them. The 5th day came in cold and clear. That was the cruelest part. Thalia had half expected a blizzard, something that would slow Mercer's men down by another few hours. Instead, the sky over Storm Ridge opened up blue and hard and sharp-edged, the kind of November morning that made the mountains look like something painted by a man who'd never actually been cold. The snow on the ground was 3 inches of fresh powder over old ice, and it caught the early sun and threw it back in all directions. Beautiful morning to lose a ranch. Beautiful morning to die. She'd been up since before dawn. Rowan had come back the night before, And that was the thing that changed the weight of the day. He'd ridden back from Holt Station not alone, but ahead of the marshal, who was a day behind him, maybe less if he pushed. Rowan had laid the documents down in front of a federal officer and talked for 2 hours, and Holt had listened, and then Holt had started asking questions rather than dismissing him, which meant he already knew pieces of what Rowan was telling him. The bank fraud, the land acquisition pattern, the pattern that stretched further than Storm Ridge, further than Montana, a thread that went all the way back to railroad land contracts in 3 territories. Mercer hadn't just been collecting debt. He'd been building something. And the federal government had started to notice before Rowan ever walked through the door. "He's coming," Rowan had said last night, sitting at the table with his coat still on. "But he won't be here by morning." That meant they were on their own until he arrived. Cassian spent the night redistributing what ammunition they had. He knew what 15 hired guns looked like. He'd scouted against worse numbers during the war, knew how they'd spread across terrain, where they'd position, how they'd come up the mountain. He walked the perimeter of the cabin in the dark and identified the angles. He showed Rowan each one. He didn't need to show Kalen, who'd grown up on this land and knew every depression and boulder and fence line from memory. Thalia cleaned and loaded the Winchester Cassian had given her. She'd had 2 evenings of instruction, which wasn't much, but she wasn't planning to be the firepower. She was planning to be the last line, positioned inside, protecting the doorway, and making sure that if it came to that, she could do what needed doing. She hoped it wouldn't come to that. It came to that. They arrived at mid-morning, coming up the mountain trail in a loose column, not bothering to hide it. 15 men on horseback, spread wide as they hit the flat approach to the ranch, Mercer in the center, wearing that dark coat that cost more than their monthly supplies. He rode like a man attending a business meeting, unhurried, already certain of the outcome. Cassian saw them from the window a full 3 minutes before they reached the fence line. "Positions," he said. Rowan went to the north side of the cabin, to the gap between the wall and the supply shed, where he'd set himself up the night before, prone, covered, sightline clear to the upper approach. He moved without a sound. Kalen went to the corral. He used the horse shelter for cover, crouched low behind the far wall, and he had a rifle and a pistol and the absolute certainty of a man fighting for the only home he'd ever known. Thalia stayed at the cabin door, inside, 1 step back from the frame, Winchester ready. Cassian stepped out onto the porch. Mercer pulled up at the fence and looked at him across the yard with the patience of a man who believed he'd already won. "Delaney," he called, "I trust you've had time to consider your options." "I've considered them," Cassian said. His voice carried easily in the cold air. He stood with his hands loose at his sides, not reaching for the rifle, leaning against the porch post beside him. "Not yet, and you'll get nothing from this ranch today." Mercer tilted his head slightly. The calculation behind his eyes was almost visible. He looked at the cabin, at the corral, at the gaps and angles around the yard, assessing what he could and couldn't see. Then he looked back at Cassian. "I have a lawful document," he said. "You have a fraudulent note acquired through a bank transaction that violated territorial transfer law," Cassian said. He said it plainly, the way Thalia had taught him to say it, not angry, not loud, just clear and precise, and in front of witnesses. "And we have a federal marshal who's been made aware of that, along with your acquisition pattern across 3 territories. He's currently on this mountain." Something moved in Mercer's expression. It wasn't fear. It wasn't even surprise, exactly. It was the recalculation of a man who'd been accounting for variables and had just discovered one he'd missed. He recovered fast. 15 men, Delaney," he said. "Quiet now." And there was something in his voice that had dropped the business meeting quality. Something older and colder underneath it. 3 brothers and a woman. Walk away, give me Miss Vance and the deed, and your brothers ride out of here today with their lives." "No," Cassian said. Mercer nodded once to the man on his right. "They came in from the sides first, the way professionals did. Not straight up the middle. That was how you got shot coming through a gate. They split, 6 men going wide to the north, 6 going wide to the south, and Mercer and his 3 closest men holding at the fence. Rowan took the first shot from the north side. He was precise and measured, the way he was precise about everything, and he didn't miss. One of the flanking riders went down from his horse and didn't get up, and the others scattered for cover, and the whole north approach became chaotic in about 4 seconds. On the south side, Kalen came up over the top of the horse shelter fence with his rifle and fired twice before dropping back down. He moved immediately, sliding left, coming up again from a different position, never staying in one place long enough to give anyone a clean shot at him. He'd been a moving target his whole life. It turned out to be useful. The yard was noise and smoke and cold air and shouting men, and Thalia stood at the cabin doorway and tracked it. She was watching Mercer. He'd pulled back behind his horse at the first shot, using the animal as cover, which told her something about him. He was a man who put other things between himself and danger. The fight moved fast. Cassian was off the porch, using the heavy water trough for cover, returning fire on the southern flank. One of Mercer's men came around the side of the cabin at a run, and Cassian was already turning, already moving, and the exchange that followed was close enough to be brutal and short enough to be over in seconds. Rowan took a bullet. She saw it happen. He'd come up for a shot on the north side, and one of the men had anticipated him, had moved to the angle Rowan hadn't covered. It caught him in the shoulder. She could see it from the way his whole left side dropped, the rifle coming down and the compensating stagger. He went back down behind the supply shed wall, and she couldn't see him anymore. And for 30 seconds, she couldn't tell if he was still moving. Then she saw his hand come around the corner of the shed and wave once. Signal. Still functional. She exhaled. Kalen from the south was covering more ground than one man should have been able to cover. He came up from behind the corral fence, fired, dropped. Came up from the left side of the horse shelter, fired, moved. He was loud about it too. She could hear him. Not words, but sound. The particular aggressive noise of a man who decided to be terrifying rather than invisible. Some of Mercer's men on the south side had stopped advancing and were just trying to pin him down, which meant they'd stopped doing other things. Then Mercer walked forward. He came out from behind his horse with his revolver up, and he walked through the yard like a man crossing a parlor, unhurried, deliberate, terrible in the way of someone who'd lived his whole life certain that consequences moved around him, and not through him. He was looking at the cabin door. He was looking at Thalia. She raised the Winchester. He saw her do it. He didn't stop. "I will have what is mine," he said, and his voice carried across the yard through the sound of gunfire on both sides, like it had been made to carry, like he'd been practicing it for years. He raised the revolver and pointed it at her. Cassian saw it at the same moment she did. He came off the ground from behind the water trough and crossed the yard in 3 long strides and put himself between the revolver and Thalia, and the shot that Mercer fired caught him in the side instead of hitting her. She heard the sound of it. She felt it in her chest the way you felt things when they happened to someone you couldn't afford to lose. Cassian didn't go down. He staggered, one hand going to his side, and then he steadied. He looked at Mercer. Mercer looked back. He reset his aim. Thalia stepped out from behind Cassian, raised the Winchester to her shoulder the way she'd been taught, and shot Mercer in the gun hand. It wasn't a clean shot. She knew that immediately, knew she'd caught the edge of his forearm rather than the hand itself, knew from the way the revolver dropped, and he lurched sideways that she'd hit bone or close to it. He went to his knees in the snow, clutching his arm, and the revolver was 4 feet away from him in the dirt. The yard went quiet. It happened in stages. Kalen stood up from behind the corral fence with his rifle still raised and looked at the scene. 3 of Mercer's remaining men on the south side looked at their employer on his knees in the snow and then looked at each other. On the north side, Rowan came around the corner of the supply shed with his rifle in his good arm, keeping his left side tight against his body. Mercer's men made the calculation that men for hire always eventually made. The math had changed. 15 had come up the mountain. Some weren't going back down, and the ones who were still standing had just watched their employer get shot by a woman with a Winchester, and the man who was supposed to be outgunned was still on his feet. Nobody moved toward the revolver in the snow. It was in that silence, that held breath of a moment, that they heard the horses, 3 of them, coming up the trail fast, and then more behind. 6 riders total, coming over the ridge at a hard pace, and in the lead was a broad man in a federal marshal's coat, badge catching the November sun, riding like he'd been riding hard for 12 hours and wasn't planning to slow down until he reached the yard. Marshal Holt pulled up at the gate and took in the scene in one long look. Mercer on his knees, revolver in the snow, 2 of his men down, the rest standing with their hands visible or getting that way quickly. 3 brothers standing at various points around the yard, one of them bleeding. A woman on the cabin porch with a Winchester. Bartholomew Mercer, Holt said. His voice was the voice of a man who'd done this before and would do it again and felt exactly nothing about the drama of it. Just the work. You're under federal arrest. Bank fraud, unlawful land acquisition, arson, and conspiracy to commit assault under federal statute. He swung down from his horse. I've been looking for a reason to ride up this mountain for 2 months. I appreciate you making it easy. 2 of his deputy marshals moved to where Mercer knelt in the snow. He didn't fight them. He'd gone somewhere else behind his eyes, calculating something Thalia couldn't see, trying to find the angle that wasn't there. She let herself look at Cassian. He was upright. His hand was pressed to his left side, and the color in his face was working against him. But he was standing, and when she crossed the yard to him, she put her hand against his to get a read on what was happening underneath, and felt the warm wet of blood through both their fingers. How bad? He said. She pressed her hand in and looked at his face. I don't know yet. How are you standing? Stubbornness? He said. I believe that. She moved to get her arm under his. Come inside. He leaned on her. She felt the full weight of him settle against her shoulder, reluctantly, like it cost him something to let it happen. She held him up and walked him toward the cabin door, and she didn't say anything about the cost because she understood it, and they got inside. Kalen was beside them in seconds, taking Cassian's other side, bearing the weight without being asked. She got Cassian onto the bed in the back room and got her medical kit open and started the assessment she'd been running in her head since the shot landed. Her hands moved. Her mind was clear. From outside, she could hear Holt's deputies moving through the yard, the sounds of men being disarmed, the professional machinery of federal law finally arriving at the place it should have been months ago. It was done. Not over there would be courts and documents and months of untangling what Mercer had built. But the man was in custody, on his knees in Montana snow, and the ranch was still standing, and everyone she cared about was still breathing. Rowan came to the doorway, his left arm held tight to his body, his face gray but steady. Go sit down, she said, without looking up from Cassian. I'll get to you in 10 minutes. I'm fine, he said. You're shot, she said. Sit down, he sat down. She worked. The back room of the Delaney cabin became an operating theater. Thalia had worked in worse. She'd worked in army tents with artillery, shaking the ground, and men dying 2 cots over, and surgeons who hadn't slept in 30 hours making decisions with shaking hands. She'd worked in the cold, and the dark, and the noise. She knew how to make a small space into what it needed to be, and she did it now without ceremony, clearing the table beside the bed, laying out her instruments in the order she'd use them, getting the water heating on the small stove in the corner that Cassian used in winter when the main room fire wasn't enough. Kalen brought extra light. 3 lanterns, all of them turned up full, positioned so the shadows fell away from the bed and not across it. Rowan sat in the doorway of the main room, which was as close to following her instruction as he was apparently capable of. She assessed Cassian first, because Cassian was the one bleeding fastest. The bullet had gone in clean through the left side, below the ribs. She probed the entry point carefully, reading the damage with her fingers, the way she'd been taught, not digging, not guessing, feeling for what the tissue told her. Deep, but not catastrophic. It had missed the organ she was most afraid of. It was lodged against the muscle wall, close enough to the surface that she could reach it without going in past the point of her instruments. "This is going to hurt," she said. "I know," Cassian said. He was lying flat, one arm over his eyes, controlling his breathing with enormous deliberate effort. "I have no laudanum left," she said. "I used the last of it on the Pruitt boy when he came to the mining camp last week." She looked at him. "I'm sorry. I need you to hold very still." He moved his arm away from his eyes and looked at her directly. "Do what you need to do," he said. Kalen stood at the head of the bed and put both hands on Cassian's shoulders, not restraining him, just present. "Ready." Cassian looked up at his youngest brother for a moment, and something passed between them that didn't need words, the particular communication of brothers who'd been through things together and understood each other past the need for language. Thalia worked. She'd done extractions under worse conditions, but never on someone she knew. That was the variable she hadn't fully accounted for. In the Army, the men on the table were strangers, and that created a useful distance. She could see the wound and the patient separately, could treat the damage without the weight of the person, complicating her focus. Now the person was Cassian Delaney, who had stood between a revolver and her body that morning, without hesitating, who talked about his father's hands with something quiet and real in his face, who had kept a promise he'd made in the first hour. She was conscious in his cabin and hadn't broken it once. She kept her hands steady. She focused on the work. The bullet came out in less than 6 minutes. She felt it the moment, the forceps, found it the hard click of metal on metal, that unmistakable sensation she'd felt dozens of times, and she worked it free with care, controlling the bleed as she went, and set it on the cloth beside the instruments without looking at it. Cassian made a single sound, one sharp exhale, bitten down immediately. He was quiet for a moment. "Then, is that fast?" "Yes," she said. "You're lucky it sat where it did." She was already cleaning the wound, working methodically. Carbolic acid and clean cloth, in the order that mattered. Some men carry bullets for years, because they go somewhere I can't follow without doing more damage than the bullet did. This one was cooperative. "First cooperative thing Mercer's ever done," Kalen said, from the head of the bed. Thalia surprised herself by almost laughing. She kept it contained, but Cassian felt the change in her hands, and looked up at her, and there was something in his face relief, maybe, that she was still capable of almost laughing. She sutured the wound closed. Clean passes, good tension, the gut thread she'd been conserving since October, because she'd known something like this was coming, even if she hadn't known the shape of it. She dressed it, and told Cassian to stay flat, and she meant it. And from the look on his face, she thought he might actually comply this time. Then she went to Rowan. He'd moved to the main room table while she worked on Cassian, which meant he'd covered about 6 feet from the doorway. Remarkable progress. He was sitting with his left arm resting on the table and his right hand holding a cloth against his shoulder. And the cloth was dark and wet, and his face had gone. The particular gray of a man managing significant blood loss through sheer refusal to acknowledge it. "How long?" she said. "Since the yard," he said. "That's 40 minutes. "I know." She sat down across from him and removed the cloth and looked at the wound. Entry wound, clean on the front of the shoulder. Exit wound, she checked the back clean on the rear. Through and through. The bullet had passed completely, which meant she wasn't extracting. She was repairing. "You're fortunate," she said. "You're the second person to tell me something good is luck today," he said, "because today you're surrounded by things that could have gone worse." She began cleaning the entry wound, and he sat absolutely still, which she'd expected. Rowan's response to pain was to become motionless and silent, to retreat somewhere deep and wait for it to be over. She'd observed this even with minor things, a cut from a fence wire, a bruised hand from the work. He didn't make noise about any of it. "The bone? I can move the arm," he said. "Show me." He raised his left arm 4 inches off the table before his face went white. She caught his arm and lowered it. "Bone is intact," she said. "You hit muscle. You're going to lose use of the arm for 6 weeks, maybe 8. After that, you should come back full." He processed this the way he processed everything, quietly and completely. 6 weeks, he said. You won't like it, she said. You're going to hate sitting still while the others work. She looked at him. But you'll do it anyway, because you're sensible enough to understand that using that arm before it heals properly means losing it permanently. He held her gaze. I'll do it, he said. Good. She worked the sutures on both sides of the wound, closed and dressed it, and fashioned a sling from a strip of heavy cloth that would keep the arm immobilized while everything knit back together. He let her do all of it without protest. She appreciated that. When she was done, she sat back and looked at both of them. Across the 2 rooms, Cassian, lying flat in the back room, staring at the ceiling with Kalen, sitting on the floor beside the bed, Rowan at the table with his arm in the sling. Kalen had a long burn across his left forearm from a bullet that had grazed him at the corral. She'd cleaned it while she worked on the others. In the brief moments, she could spare a hand, and he'd barely reacted. He was examining it now with the same detached curiosity he brought to most things that had happened to his body over 22 years of being Kalen Delaney. The afternoon light was going. Outside, she could hear the sounds of Holt's deputies finishing their work horses, voices, the creak of wagon wheels. Mercer's men who'd surrendered were being transported down the mountain. The ones who hadn't were being dealt with in the manner of men who hadn't. She made coffee. She made it because her hands needed something to do, while her mind worked through what came next. And because the 4 of them were going to need the warmth of it before the evening was done. She brought cups to everyone. She sat at the table across from Rowan, and Kalen came out of the back room and sat beside her, and the 3 of them could see Cassian through the open doorway. He'll be all right, Kalen said. He wasn't asking. He needed to hear it stated. He'll be all right, Thalia said. He needs a week flat and then careful movement for a month. But yes, he'll be all right. Kalen drank his coffee and looked at the table for a long moment. When he looked up, he had the expression of someone who'd been preparing to say something difficult and had decided to say it anyway. I think we all know, he started. Rowan looked at him. Kalen looked at Rowan and then at Thalia, and he pushed through whatever had stopped him. We all love you, he said. He said it plainly, without decoration, which was not how Kalen usually said anything. The directness of it landed harder than embellishment would have. Each of us, differently maybe, but completely. He turned his cup in his hands, and none of us think it's fair to ask you to choose or to put you in a position where you feel like you owe any one of us more than another. He paused. Cassian wanted to be the one to say this, but he's on his back in there, and I'm not waiting, so if it makes more sense for you to be with one of us, any one of us, just say it. We'll figure out the rest. The fire crackled in the stove. Outside, the wind had come up off the mountain, soft and cold, the first breath of real winter coming in now that the violence of the day had cleared. Thalia looked at Kalen. She looked at Rowan. She thought about Cassian on his back in the next room, having taken a bullet for her, without 1 second of deliberation. She thought about what love was. In the world, she'd come from the world of contracts and arrangements, of men deciding what a woman was worth, and writing it down on official paper. She thought about Mercer, who had looked at her and seen a possession. She thought about the broker in Philadelphia, who'd sold her destination like he was arranging the shipment of furniture. Then she thought about this cabin, these men, this mountain. She thought about Cassian making coffee with her at 2 in the morning and talking about tracking through fresh snow. Rowan reading her expression with more accuracy than most surgeons read a wound. Kalen learning the financial ledger column by column, swallowing his pride and pushing through because she'd told him it mattered. I know what love looks like when it's being used as a tool, she said. I've seen it up close for most of my adult life. A man telling you he loves you, so you'll agree to something. A man telling you he loves you, so you'll stay quiet. She looked at both of them, and her voice was steady because she meant every word of what she was about to say. What I have here is not that. What I have here is 3 men who kept their word from the first night I woke up with a scalpel in my hand, who never asked me to be smaller than I am, who treated what I know and what I can do as something real. She paused. I'm not choosing between you. Not because I can't, but because I don't believe that love has to be a competition with one winner and two people who lose. Rowan looked at her for a long time. She could see him working through it, turning it over with the thoroughness he brought to everything. "You're certain," he said. "I've never been more certain of anything," she said. From the back room, Cassian's voice came, rougher than usual but clear. "I heard all of that." Kalen looked toward the doorway. "You're supposed to be resting." "I'm resting. My ears work fine." There was a beat of silence, and then Kalen laughed. It started small and became real. The full, unguarded laugh she'd heard from him, half a dozen times, the one that was nothing but genuine and took up the whole room. Even Rowan's mouth curved. Thalia stood up and walked to the doorway of the back room. Cassian was lying exactly where she'd left him, flat on his back, but his eyes were open, and they were on her, steady and dark, and full of something she'd been watching grow in him since that first night on the cold porch under the hard Montana stars. "You were awake the whole time," she said. "Most of it." And he was quiet for a moment. His hand rested on the blanket over the bandaged wound, and he looked at her the way he'd looked at the stars, like something he'd needed to find, and wasn't going to look away from now that he had. "And I think my mother would have liked you," he said. "She planted those herbs on the ceiling. She believed in useful things and people who did what needed doing without being asked." He paused. "She would have liked you." Thalia stood in the doorway for a moment. Then she went to the chair beside his bed and sat down because he needed monitoring through the night, and she was going to be the one doing it. And there was no other place she had any intention of being. Outside, the first real snow of winter had begun to fall, soft and steady, covering the scorched ground where the hay barn had stood, covering the churned mud of the yard, covering the tracks of men who were gone now and not coming back. Inside the cabin, the fire held. Rowan sat at the table and drank his coffee. Kalen fed the stove another log and leaned against the wall, close enough to the doorway to see his brother's face. The four of them occupied the same space in the same silence. And it wasn't the silence of strangers, and it wasn't the silence of people with things left unresolved. It was the silence of people who had come through something together and were still there on the other side. That was its own kind of answer, maybe the clearest one there was. Snow fell on Storm Ridge, and the cabin held its warmth, and Thalia Vance kept watch through the night over everyone inside it. 3 weeks after the battle, the first proper snowfall of winter came to Storm Ridge, not a blizzard, not the violent white wall that had announced Thalia's arrival in October. This was something quieter snow that fell straight down in the still air, fat and slow, covering everything evenly, making the mountain look like something out of a picture book, instead of the hard, working land it actually was. Cassian was on his feet by the second week, which was earlier than she'd ordered, and exactly when she'd expected. She'd stopped arguing about it on day 9, when she realized that keeping him horizontal was genuinely more effort than managing his recovery while he was upright. He moved carefully. He didn't do anything that pulled the wound. He was, in his way, a good patient, as long as you defined good as someone who obeyed the parts of your instructions he agreed with and applied his own judgment to the rest. Rowan's shoulder was healing well. He wore the sling with the dignity of a man who decided that if he had to be inconvenienced, he was going to be inconvenienced without complaining about it. He read. He worked on the territorial law documents with Holt, who'd been up to the ranch twice since the arrest, building the case against Mercer that would eventually move through federal court. Kalen's arm healed fastest because Kalen was 22 and built like something that refused to stay damaged. He was back in the corral within a week, and Thalia had watched him from the window, one morning working with a young mare that had been spooked by the gunfight and hadn't fully settled since. He'd spent 2 hours with her, just presence and patience, voice low, hands steady. The mare had let him brush her by the end of it. The mortgage note was in federal hold pending review of the transfer fraud. Holt had been clear about the timeline, months, not weeks, before the courts resolved it. But the foreclosure was frozen. Mercer was in custody in Billings, and his reach had contracted dramatically once his hired men had scattered, and the federal case had begun to have weight. The ranch was safe. Not permanently, not on paper yet, but safe enough to breathe. And Thalia had started, for the first time in years, to actually breathe. She noticed it in small ways. She wasn't counting exits when she walked into a room anymore. She wasn't calculating distances to the door, running through escape routes as a reflex. She slept. Through the night. She woke up without the particular cold dread she'd carried since Boston, the first-second awareness, before full consciousness that something was wrong and had been wrong for a long time. It wasn't wrong anymore. She noticed that, too. The evening of the first real snowfall, she cooked something proper. Not survival cooking, not the necessary and efficient meals she'd been making since October. She went through the supply shelves and found things she'd been noting for weeks: dried herbs from Cassian's mother's ceiling, a piece of smoked ham Briggs had included in their last order, root vegetables that were still good in the cold store, a small paper of spices she'd bought at the general store without explaining why. She made a real dinner. It took 3 hours, and she didn't apologize for any of it. The brothers came to the table one by one, drawn by the smell, each of them stopping in the doorway for a moment before they sat down. Kaylin said, "What is that?" "Dinner?" she said. "That's not what dinner smells like." "That's what dinner smells like when someone has time to make it correctly," she said. They ate together, and the meal was good, and the conversation was easy in the comfortable way that things were easy when they'd stopped being performed. Nobody was managing anyone else. Nobody was working to fill silence or prove something. Cassian told a story about a failed hunting trip from 3 winters ago that involved Kaylin, a misread set of tracks, and a bear that had been deeply unimpressed by both of them. Kaylin objected loudly to several details. Rowan confirmed the parts Cassian had right, which were most of them. Thalia sat at the table and listened, and felt the warmth of it move through her the same way. Heat moved through a body after cold, from the core outward, slow and real and unmistakable. After dinner, she cleared the table and left the men at it, taking her cup to the window and looking out at the snow. The yard was white and smooth in the dark. The tree line was a soft black edge against the sky. The stars were out above the clouds, not visible but present, the way they always were. She stood there for a while. She was thinking about something she'd been moving toward for days, circling it carefully, not because she was afraid of it, but because she wanted to be certain. She'd spent enough of her life doing things from urgency or necessity that she wanted this, whatever this was going to be, to come from something else entirely. It came from choice. That was the thing she kept coming back to. Every decision she'd made in this cabin since October had been hers. Nobody had asked her to organize the medical kit, or teach Kaylin the ledger, or ride to the mining camps, or stand in the yard with a Winchester. She'd done those things because she'd chosen to, and the choosing had been the point. She was choosing now, too. She set her cup on the shelf. She turned around. All 3 of them were at the table. Cassian with his coffee. Rowan with a book open that he wasn't reading. Kaylin with his feet up on the bench that he knew Cassian hated, because some things didn't change. She walked to the back room. She let her dress fall away. She put on the simple white cotton shift she'd kept clean since Boston, for reasons she hadn't fully examined at the time and now understood completely. She stood at the small mirror on the wall and looked at herself, not with a critical inventory she'd been performing on herself since she was 16, and someone had first told her she was too small, too sharp, too much, but plainly, clearly, the way she looked at patience. What was there? What was real? She was real. She was whole. She was here, by her own choice, and nobody else's. She came out of the back room. She stepped into the main room, letting her dress fall away, standing before the 3 men in full confidence, beauty, and absolute self-ownership. The fire was burning low and orange, and the lanterns were lit, and the light was warm across everything. And she stood in the middle of it without flinching. The room went very still. All 3 of them were looking at her, not the way men looked at objects, not with calculation or appraisal. With something that had stopped their breath, reverence was the word for it, she decided. The particular stillness of people who'd encountered something they hadn't expected to be allowed to witness. Cassian's hands were flat on the table. He wasn't moving. He looked at her the way he'd looked at the clear winter sky after months of storm, like something he'd needed without knowing how to name it. Rowan had closed the book. His eyes were on her, steady and deep. The way he was steady and deep about everything that mattered to him, and she could see that she mattered to him in the fullest possible sense of that word. Kaylin was the only one who'd moved, and he'd moved forward without seeming to decide to just an inch, just a lean, a body pulled toward something involuntarily. They hesitated, all three of them, not from lack of wanting. She could see that clearly, but from the same deep reverence that made them careful with her, that had made them careful from the very first night. They'd been so careful for so long, so deliberate about not taking what wasn't offered. She crossed the room. She stopped in front of Cassian. She placed his large calloused hand on her hip, his hand, the hand that had carried compresses to her frozen feet on the night she arrived, the hand that had built this cabin's fence and shot its horses, and pressed into a bullet wound to keep himself standing in a yard full of armed men, all so he could be the wall between her and the barrel of a gun. She placed his hand on her hip, and she felt it close around her, warm and steady and completely sure. And she looked at him, and then she looked over her shoulder at Rowan and at Kaylin, and she felt 3 years of fear and running and surviving fall away from her like something she'd finally been allowed to put down. She smiled, not carefully, not strategically. A real smile, full and certain, the smile of a woman who had found the edges of herself and discovered they were wider than anyone had told her. "I'm your wife," she whispered. "Now, can I suck it?" Cassian looked at her for one long moment, his hand warm on her hip, and she watched every wall he'd ever built against the world quietly come down. He pulled her close. What followed was not a negotiation and not a performance. It was 4 people in a warm room in the middle of winter, in the quiet dark of a Montana mountain, finally putting down the weight of everything they'd been carrying alone. Cassian moved with a reverence that undid her deliberate, attentive, as careful with her as he was with everything he decided mattered. But underneath the care was a warmth she hadn't known was in him, deep and real and long held. His hands were calloused and gentle, and she discovered that the combination was its own kind of grace. Rowan was exactly what she'd known he'd be, focused absolutely, present in a way few people ever managed to be present, as if she were the only thing in the world worth paying attention to. He was quiet about it, no words, just watching and reading and responding to what he found with the same precision he brought to everything he studied. She had the overwhelming sense of being truly seen, not as a surface or a symbol, but as herself, completely. Kaylin was fire and warmth and joy, which was the only word for it, joy, the purely physical expression of someone who was deeply, uncomplicated glad to exist in this moment. He laughed once, quietly, at something she said, and the laugh was real and uncalculated, and she thought it might be the most attractive thing she'd encountered in her life. They forgot everything. That was the exact truth of it. The mortgage and the court case and the burnt hay barn and the bullet and Mercer on his knees in the snow, all of it went somewhere else entirely. And what was left was just this: 4 people, 1 cabin, the snow falling outside in the dark, and the fire burning down to its deep amber coals. She didn't know how much time passed. She didn't try to track it. At some point, she was lying in the warmth, with Cassian's arm across her and Kellen's hand in her hair, and Rowan sitting upright against the wall nearby, close enough to be present, watching the coals in the stove, with an expression that was the most peaceful she'd ever seen on his face. The fire was almost out. Nobody moved to rebuild it. Outside, the snow was still falling, soft and steady, and Storm Ridge was absolutely quiet. And she lay in the dark and felt the warmth of these 3 men around her and thought about the contract in her oilskin case and what it had been and what it wasn't anymore. It had been an escape route, a legal document she'd used to put distance between herself and a man who believed paper could define a person. It had brought her to a wagon in a blizzard, to a cabin she'd woken up in, with a scalpel in her fist, and 3 enormous strangers keeping a respectful distance. It had brought her here. She didn't close her eyes for a long time. She stayed awake on purpose, the way she'd stayed awake in field hospitals on the good nights, not because crisis required it, but because the absence of crisis was something worth witnessing. Kalen's breathing went slow beside her. Cassian was already asleep, warm and steady against her back. Rowan looked over from the wall and met her eyes in the near dark, and something moved between them, quiet and mutual, the acknowledgement of 2 people who were awake when everyone else had finally rested. She mouthed, "Go to sleep." He almost smiled. He closed his eyes. She lay in the warm dark and listened to the snow. Spring came late to the mountain, the way it always did. March was still cold, still sending down hard frosts at night, still keeping the upper ridge locked in white. But by April, the snow line had pulled back visibly, a little more each morning, and the mud underneath was the deep, rich brown of ground that had been compressed under snow for 5 months and was finally being allowed to breathe. Thalia noticed the exact morning the change happened. She was up before the others, which was normal. Now she'd always been an early riser, and the ranch rewarded it, the morning hours being the quiet ones, where she could think without interruption and plan, without anyone needing anything from her immediately. She made coffee and stood at the window, and the light coming over the eastern ridge was different. Not the flat gray-white of winter light, something with gold in it, something with the particular quality of a sun that had been holding its breath for months and was finally letting it out. Spring. She put her hand on her stomach, without thinking, the way she'd been doing for 6 weeks. 6 weeks of knowing and not saying. Not because she was afraid. She'd moved past afraid some months ago and hadn't found her way back to it. She'd been quiet about it because she'd wanted to be certain first, and then because she'd wanted to choose the right moment. And now she was running out of reasons to wait, and the morning was gold on the mountains. And the coffee was hot in her other hand. And it was time. She heard Cassian in the back room. The particular sound of him getting up, careful still, slower than before the bullet, but with the basic solidness of a man whose body had decided to fully forgive him for what November had done to it. The wound had healed clean. She'd checked it herself twice a week through the winter, and by February there was nothing to check anymore. Just a new scar to add to the collection he'd been building over 31 years of an unsentimental life. He came out and stood in the doorway and looked at her at the window. "Gold, light," she said. He looked past her at the ridge. He was quiet for a moment, reading it the way he read everything outdoors completely, with the accumulated knowledge of a man who'd been watching this specific piece of sky for most of his life. "First real spring morning," he said. "Yes." He came to get his coffee, and she turned from the window and sat at the table. And he sat across from her, and she looked at him in the gold morning light, with the scar on the left side of his face, catching it and turning it warm, and she decided this was the moment. "I need to tell you something," she said. He set his cup down. She told him. She watched his face as she spoke. She was good at reading faces. It was one of the first things you learned in medicine, how to track what a person's body was doing while their mind was still catching up. Cassian's face moved through things she hadn't seen on it before. Something wide and open, then something almost frightened, then something that settled past the fear into a place she didn't have a precise word for. She thought the closest word was home. "How long?" he said. "I've known for 6 weeks," she said. "I wanted to be certain." "Are you?" "Yes." He was quiet for a long moment. He looked at his hands on the table, then at her, then at the window where the gold light was getting stronger as the sun came fully up over the ridge. "A child," he said. "A child," she confirmed. He stood up. He came around the table, and he crouched down beside her chair and took her hands in his, the way he did things that mattered deliberately, with his full attention, not making it a performance, but making it real. "I want you to know," he said, "that this child has a family. Whatever comes, whatever the courts do with the mortgage, wherever we land in a year or 5 years, this child has a family." She looked at him. Her eyes were dry. She'd done her crying about this privately. 3 weeks ago, in the early morning quiet, the specific tears of a woman who had spent years believing certain things were not available to her and was still in the process of being proven wrong. "I know," she said. Rowan came out next, Cassian told him. He didn't make a ceremony of it, just stood up and said it plainly, the way Cassian said everything that mattered. Rowan stood in the doorway and listened, and his face did the things Rowan's face did when something moved him, deeply went very still, then very present, then shifted into something that opened up around his eyes. He looked at Thalia. "Are you well?" he asked. The first question, the practical one, because that was Rowan. "Very well," she said. He nodded, slow and complete. He moved to the table and sat down. He didn't say more than that for a little while, but she'd learned to read his silences the way she'd learned to read everything about him. And this one was full, not empty. He was taking it in, making room for it. Kalen woke up last, as he always did, pulled out of sleep reluctantly, and arriving in the morning world with the general energy of someone who'd been in the middle of something good and resented the interruption. He came out of the back room with his hair wrong and his boots in his hand, and stopped when he saw all three of them at the table. "Looking at," he said. Cassian looked at Thalia. She nodded. She nodded. She told Kalen herself. His reaction was entirely, completely, perfectly Kalen. He dropped his boots. He looked at her. He looked at Cassian, and then at Rowan, and then back at her. He sat down heavily in the nearest chair. He picked his boots back up. He set them down again. "We're having a baby," he said. "Yes," Thalia said. He put his face in his hands. Not distressed, she could see his shoulders, which were doing the thing they did when he was trying to contain something too large for his usual channels. When he looked up, his eyes were bright, and his face was doing approximately 4 things at once. "We're having a baby," he said again, to no one in particular. "You said that," Rowan observed. "I'm allowed to say it twice." He looked at Thalia, and beneath all the noise and motion in his face, there was something absolutely serious. "You're going to be the best mother on this mountain." "I'm going to be the only mother on this mountain," she said. "That too," he grinned. "But also the best," she laughed. Real and full, the laugh she'd been finding more frequently since November, the one that came from somewhere past the careful management she'd practiced for so long. The morning moved forward. They made breakfast together, all 4 of them in the small kitchen space, which was crowded and loud and warm. Kalen burned the first batch of Johnny cakes because he kept getting distracted. Rowan sliced the smoked meat with his good arm in even pieces. Cassian stood at the stove with his coffee and directed traffic and periodically moved Kellen away from things he was about to ruin. Thalia set the table and watched them and felt something settle in her chest that she'd been waiting a long time to feel. The legal situation resolved in May. Holt came up the mountain one morning with the federal judgment in his saddlebag and a look on his face that was as close to satisfaction as she suspected. He allowed himself professionally. The mortgage transfer had been ruled fraudulent under territorial statute. The note was invalidated. The Delaney land was clear. Mercer's case was working through federal court in Billings. The railroad fraud had added weight that the Montana charges alone wouldn't have carried, and Holt's assessment was that the man was looking at years, possibly the remainder of his useful life, behind the kind of walls that didn't negotiate. She read the judgment twice. She put it in the oilskin case with the other documents, the original contract, the instrument purchase records, the wage documentation, and she kept the case on the shelf in the main room where she could see it, not as a reminder of danger, as a record of how things had gone and how they'd turned out. The medical clinic came from her idea and the brothers' labor. She'd mentioned it to Cassian in March casually, not a proposal. Just thinking aloud that the Valley ranchers had no medical access for 50 miles in any direction, that she'd been making supply runs to the mining camps all winter, and there was clear and genuine need, and that a small structure attached to the eastern side of the ranch would not require much to build and would serve a significant community need. Cassian had listened. He'd asked 3 questions, the practical kind, about supply sourcing and traffic and winter accessibility. She'd answered them. He'd nodded once. By April, he and Kaylin were building. The schoolhouse was Rowan's contribution. He'd brought it up quietly one evening, with the directness he used when he'd thought something through, fully, and was ready to say it. Children in the valley have no school within a day's ride, he said. If there's a clinic drawing families to the area, there will be children. There will, Thalia agreed. I can teach, he said. Reading, mathematics, basic sciences, tracking, and wilderness skills. I'd rather be useful than idle. She'd looked at him across the table. His shoulder was fully healed. By then, the arm back to complete function, the whole long winter of careful patience having delivered exactly what she'd promised it would. You'd be excellent at it, she said. He had been. The first session, in June, was 7 children from 4 Valley families. By August, it was 11. By the following spring, it would be more. But she didn't know that yet. What she knew was the morning in August, when she stood on the porch of the Delaney cabin and watched the sunrise come over Storm Ridge. Summer light was different from the gold of spring. It was higher and broader, casting long shadows off the mountain peaks, and then burning them away as it climbed. And the valley below was green in a way that was almost shocking after so many months of white and brown. The clinic was finished and functioning. The schoolhouse had a window that caught the eastern light. The hay barn had been rebuilt larger than before and was already a third full against the coming winter. She heard the door and didn't turn around. Cassian came to stand beside her, the way he had on a cold November porch, what felt like a lifetime ago. He was carrying 2 cups of coffee. He handed her one. Rowan came out next, moving quietly, standing on her other side. Kaylin came last, and he leaned against the porch post and looked out at the valley with the expression of a man taking inventory of everything he loved and finding the count satisfactory. Her stomach was round under her hand where it rested there. The child inside steady and real and healthy she knew, because she'd been monitoring it with everything she had, because she was who she was, and she applied herself to everything completely. A child raised with the love, strength, and protection of all 3 fathers. She looked out at the mountain. 3 years ago, she'd been in Boston, small and precise, and building a life in the narrow spaces a man's ambition had left her. A year ago, she'd been climbing into a freight wagon in a snowstorm with an oilskin document case, and the surgical scalpel she'd carried since Philadelphia, and the desperate hope that distance was the same thing as freedom. She knew now that it wasn't. Distance was just distance. It got you somewhere new, but it didn't make the new place yours. What made a place yours was what you built there, what you chose to keep, and what you let go, who you stood beside when it mattered. She'd built something here. They all had. Not just the clinic and the schoolhouse. Not just the repaired fence lines and the rebuilt barn. Something in the air of the cabin, in the rhythm of mornings and evenings, and the particular quiet of this mountain at night, when the stars were out and the fire was down to coals, and 4 people were sleeping safely inside the same log walls. Quiet morning, Kaylin said. Best kind, Cassian said. Rowan said nothing. He turned his face toward the sun coming up over the ridge, and she could see it catch in his eyes. The light that was finally unobstructed by cloud or storm or anything that meant to do them harm. She drank her coffee. Below them, the valley was waking up. Somewhere down the mountain, smoke was rising from a chimney. A hawk was moving in lazy circles over the southern meadow. The horses in the corral were stirring, beginning the small morning business of being horses. Storm Ridge in summer. Storm Ridge at peace. She'd come here running. She'd come here with a scalpel and a lie and a desperate handful of paper documents. And she'd woken up in this cabin with her feet wrapped in warm compresses and 3 strangers keeping a respectful distance, and she'd thought, I can work with this. She could. She had. True freedom is not running away from the world. It is finding a place where your dignity is respected, your voice is heard, and love knows no fear. She'd read those words in a book once, long ago, in a Philadelphia library before everything had gone wrong, and they'd seemed theoretical then, the kind of sentiment that lived in books, because it didn't quite fit in the world. She understood now that they were just accurate. The person who'd written them had simply been somewhere they were true. This was somewhere they were true. The sun came all the way up over the mountain, and Storm Ridge turned gold, and Thalia Vance stood on the porch of the home she'd chosen with the three men she'd chosen, and the child who would be born into that choosing, and she looked at the light on the mountains and let it be exactly what it was. Enough. More than enough. Everything. Storm Ridge isn't just a love story set against the brutal beauty of the Montana frontier. It's a story about what happens when human beings stop treating each other as property and start treating each other as people worth protecting. Thalia Vance arrived on that mountain with nothing but a forged escape route, a surgeon's scalpel, and the hard-won knowledge that survival was something she'd been doing alone for far too long. She didn't come looking for love. She came looking for distance. What she found instead was something the frontier rarely offered, and the world she'd left behind had never once given her. Men who kept their word, not because the law required it, but because their honor demanded it. That's the first lesson this story carries. A promise made in the dark to a woman unconscious and unable to hold you accountable is the truest measure of a man's character. Cassian Delaney made that promise in the first hour. He never broke it, not once. And in a world full of men who used legal language to dress up theft men like Mercer, who believed that ownership was just paperwork with the right seal, that kind of quiet, consistent integrity was the most radical thing on the mountain. The second lesson lives in Thalia herself. She is not rescued. Let that land for a moment, because it matters enormously. She wakes up in a stranger's cabin with a scalpel already in her hand. She negotiates the terms of her own safety before she's fully warm. She reorganizes the medical kit, teaches the bookkeeping, rides alone to the mining camps, and puts a bullet in the man who threatens everything she's chosen, all from her own knowledge, her own courage, her own deliberate choice. The Delaney brothers provide the roof and the firelight. Thalia provides the architecture of survival. She is not a woman who is saved. She is a woman who saves and who allows herself, finally, to be loved in the process. Those are two very different things, and the difference is everything. The third lesson is the one that cuts deepest, and it's the one Mercer can never understand, no matter how many legal documents he produces. He builds his power on isolation. He counts on each person believing they are the only one in debt, the only one afraid, the only one who made a mistake they can't recover from. His entire empire depends on people never comparing notes. The moment Cassian rides to his neighbors and says, "This is what he did to us, and I believe he's done it to you too," that's the moment the empire begins to collapse. Not from violence, though there is violence. From the simple, devastating act of people choosing not to be alone in their trouble anymore. That is the story's greatest truth, and it belongs as much to the 21st century as it does to 1878. The systems that exploit people, whether they come dressed in frontier mortgage fraud or modern contract language, survive on silence. They survive on the particular shame of believing your situation is uniquely your fault. The antidote has always been the same. Find the person beside you who is standing on the same ground, and say so out loud. True freedom, as this story quietly insists from beginning to end, is not the act of running away. It is the act of arriving somewhere your dignity is intact, your voice carries weight, and the people around you have proven, not promised, proven that they will stand beside you when it costs them something real. Thalia ran from Boston with a scalpel and a contract, and a desperate hope that distance might be the same thing as freedom. She learned, on a snow-covered Montana mountain, that distance just gets you somewhere new. What makes a place yours is what you build there, who you stand beside, and what you refuse to surrender, even when the walls are closing in from all four sides. That is what Storm Ridge is about. that is what it leaves behind. This story is a work of fiction created for entertainment purposes. All characters, events, and situations depicted are entirely imaginary and bear no relation to real persons or historical events.